Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is time for reflection. Our time for reflection leader today is Peter Kelly, the Director of the Poverty Alliance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for the invitation to address the Parliament today. As many of you will know, one of the main aims of the Poverty Alliance is to raise awareness and improve public understanding about poverty and inequality in Scotland. In doing this, we're often called on to give talks and presentations about the issues. Over the years, we've spoken to thousands of people across Scotland, from school pupils to trade unionists, frontline workers and campaigners, and of course politicians. We're asked to talk about the impact on individuals and communities, or to highlight the root causes of what poverty is. And of course, we're always asked to identify the solutions. In these talks, we often focus on the trends and the statistics. You'll be familiar with many of these: the 200,000 children in Scotland who live in low-income households, the almost 1 million homes affected by fuel poverty, or the 400,000 workers paid less than a living wage. But we know what makes an impact is when we talk about the real lives behind those numbers, the people, not the statistics. People like the young woman I know in Fife. She's a lone parent, sometimes struggling to feed her family or to heat her home. But she's at college now, and in the long term, she'll get her degree and she'll continue to make a contribution to her community. Or the man from Glasgow that we work with, whose life has been scarred by drugs and by crime, who is now clean and in recovery, and he now spends much of his time volunteering and helping others make the journey he has made. There are hundreds, thousands of lives like these in Scotland, ones that confound the expectations we have of poverty, lives that highlight that real change is possible for individuals and that people are more than just passive victims. But these stories also remind us that labels such as skiver, scrounger or cheat just don't fit. Now, when it comes to what we do about poverty, we have choices to make. As our elected representatives, you have more say over those choices than most. You'll rightly debate about how we use our resources and focus our energies. But in those debates, never forget the people behind the statistics. For in treating people living in poverty with dignity, not as merely numbers or problems, as we would expect to be treated, I believe that we increase the chances of finding the lasting solutions to poverty that I know we all seek. Thank you very much.
The next item of business is one that I know we would prefer not be holding. It's a motion of condolence in the name of Joanne Lamont following the death of Helen Eadie. This is another sad day for our Parliament as we pay our own tribute to Helen Eadie, our friend and our colleague. In doing so, I wish to welcome to the Parliament Helen's husband Bob, her daughters Fiona and Gemma, and their family and friends. Helen had already announced that she would not stand at the next election. She wanted to spend more time with her family and more particularly with her grandsons, who brought her such joy. Sadly, that was not to be, as she was taken from them and us much too soon. I knew Helen for at least 25 years, starting from when she was a Fife councillor. We were both delighted to be elected as MSPs in 1999. Helen was quite unique. She was kind, caring and compassionate, not just to her constituents, but to her colleagues too. Many of us can tell of her personal kindness in times of illness or difficulties. During her time as a parliamentarian, Helen served on many committees of the Parliament, including public petitions, equal opportunities, and latterly on the European External Relations and on the Standards and Public Appointments Committee as Deputy Convener. She worked tirelessly for her constituents and the communities she served. Helen was never afraid to be different, to be true to her own beliefs, even if that meant disagreeing with the prevailing view. She always argued her case with passion and conviction, and we will all miss her. Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I rise to move the motion of condolence to Helen Eadie with a heavy heart, a sadness at her loss which I know is shared across this chamber and far beyond, and still shocked at the suddenness of her illness and her passing. And I know Helen's family, who are here today, have been touched and moved by the warmth of the tributes to Helen and the support to them at this terrible, rawest time of loss, when they may feel the gap so keenly in the passing of Helen. And may I thank the party leaders, the presiding officers, all MSPs past and present, MPs, councillors, folk from all ears and pates, from Fife and elsewhere across Scotland, who joined us at her funeral to mark the passing and celebrate the life of a woman who defied simple definition. Helen was one of the class of '99, part of that group who came together as the Scottish Parliament was created, marked out from the beginning as a woman of deep passion for a politics that was inclusive, a woman driven by a desire to create a better, fairer Scotland, spurred by a deep conviction that injustice, social, political or economic, could be tackled. It didn't have to be this way. And from the start, it was evident that Helen, as a socialist and cooperator, did not simply talk about what she cared about. She campaigned, she championed, she got things done. Born in Stenhousemuir, Helen had a lifelong commitment to the values of the labour and cooperative movement. Leaving school at 15, she quickly became involved in trade union activity, and I understand equally quickly was sacked for that trade union activity, and later went on to work for many years with the GMB in London, and also influencing the Labour Party at its very heart, at its very centre, throughout the 70s, an achievement which she was so modest about that most of us were not properly aware of what she had done. And when Helen and her family returned to Scotland in the mid-80s, she was appointed to the post of manager of West Fife Enterprise, starting her new job on the first day of the miners' strike in 1984. And her evident love for all of Fife's communities and her passion to support in particular those ex-mining communities, working with the Coalfield Regeneration Trust amongst others, was shaped by the impact of that strike on the families and communities that she tried hard to support through those times. Helen's CV is a rich one of great achievement at a time when women were still far less visible in political life than they should have been. She was a pioneer for women, and her lifelong commitment to equality shaped her every action. But Helen was far more than her list of achievements. She was a woman of great warmth and compassion, and I was struck by the new members to our group after 2011, who all have given testimony to our warmth and welcome to them when they came to this Parliament, which was a very difficult time for the Labour Party itself. She could inspire great loyalty and affection, and this is no more evident than amongst her constituents. And this, I believe, was because of her focus on making things happen, making sure that not only did she talk about what she could do, but actually delivered. And I understand that her commitment on childcare brought her to establish a cooperative nursery in London many, many years ago, which is still going strong. And watching Helen champion the cause of disabled workers in Remploy, or speaking out on behalf of families without the proper care and support they needed, I was always struck by the almost physical impact on her, the emotional drain on her of her desire to give them a voice. She did not simply represent people, she stood with them. Beyond simple empathy, she felt their troubles, which gave her an even steelier resolve to get the help or action required. And when on occasion she incurred the wrath of the presiding officer, it was almost because of her overwhelming sense of injustice, her desire to make the case for action, that led her to ignore the warnings from the chair to draw her remarks to a conclusion. There is no doubt that some underestimated Helen's capacities and abilities. She didn't fit the stereotype of a politician, but it is, I believe, equally true that it was her unique and non-stereotypical approach to politics that engendered such love and affection from her constituents and all those who needed her to work so effectively as she did in the cross-party groups she served in this Parliament. Helen was an unlikely rebel, and we all know how much party leaders love rebels. But rebel she did on occasion, always driven not by the desire to be noticed, but in her absolute conviction of the right or wrong of an issue which led her to act. Helen was a fine parliamentarian, taking her role in committees seriously, tirelessly in looking at legislation and interrogating the minister, making sure that ministers were held to account. Helen was an internationalist, proudly, fiercely pro-Europe when it was not always in fashion in the Labour Party, and until her death still championing the interests of people across Eastern Europe, most recently Bulgaria. The love and admiration of her constituents did translate into political support at elections, not least in 2011, when many of us suffered electoral defeat and difficult times. But I do believe that this support was a harvest she earned for the work she did, but that harvest was not the purpose of her work. The work she did, her motives in her campaigning, were not to secure these votes, but to make a difference to people's lives. And I believe that is one of the many lessons we can take from Helen about how to do politics. Helen was a woman with a twinkle in her eyes, of modesty, of loyalty, of great warmth and deep compassion. And I count myself privileged to have been a recipient of, over many years, of her kindness and generous praise. But above all, she was a woman who knew love. In her long and happy marriage to Bob, who loved and was loved in equal measure by her daughters, her son-in-law, her beloved grandchildren and her family. And those who attended the funeral yesterday, who saw all those wonderful photographs of Helen's life, must have been struck like me by how happy Helen always seemed, how warm and enriched her family life was, and how much more bitter it makes now the loss that her family is to be denied the planned retirement when she was going to be able to spend even more time with her precious boys. And I was asked, what would Helen Eadie's legacy be? And I think it is this, that politics can be honest, that political action can be part of communities, not separate from them, that politicians doing their job can make the world a better place, that as a society we can cooperate, not compete, that it is possible to do things in a different way and that injustice in all its form should be refused. But above all, her legacy to her beloved family, to know and understand the values of equality, justice and community, and to know what love really is. We salute Helen in all her many facets. We thank her for all she did, and we mark the passing of a wife, mother, mother-in-law, sister and grandmother, whose loss to those who loved her most is beyond words. Farewell, Helen. We shall miss you.
I now call First Minister Alex Salmond.
On behalf of the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government, let me join in supporting the motion from Joanne Lamont, paying tribute to Helen Eadie and, of course, expressing our condolences to her family, her husband Bob and her daughters Fiona and Gemma. This is the third motion of condolence in this chamber over the last few months. Brian Adam, David McCletchie and now Helen Eadie. All three lost to cancer, and all three who were members of this Parliament from the beginning, from 1999. All of them, all three, combined a deep sense of public service and also a high level of personal popularity. As part of this Parliament's founding generation, they helped us establish it as a positive force in Scottish public life. They remind us that the many successes of this chamber, and there have been many, are due to members of all political parties. Helen was committed to politics and to the trade union movement from a young age. However, greater service in terms of public life came after her return to Scotland, first as a councillor and then as an MSP for Dunfermline East and more recently Cowdenbeath. She was a dedicated parliamentarian, a tireless constituency MSP who never shrank from championing her constituents and the causes they believed in. Those of us who were fortunate enough to be at the funeral service yesterday, and I say fortunate because of the insight, the wonderful insight it gave us into Helen's life, were not surprised to hear that she worked on constituency business even from her hospital bed for as long as she possibly could. And that commitment, as Joanne Lamont rightly says, was reflected in popularity with her constituents. At the last election, she not just retained her seat, but she increased her share of the vote. In some ways, the ultimate test of any politician's connection with their constituents, whether they can do that against the prevailing tide, against the prevailing wind. And Helen succeeded marvellously at the last election. I didn't necessarily think that at the time, but nonetheless, she succeeded marvellously. against a prevailing wind. Now, Helen's motivation for entering politics was a passion for social justice, a desire to see everyone got a decent shout and a fair chance. She fed her commitment to the European cause, and in particular her concern for the integration of Eastern Europeans into Scottish society. Tam Dael, who is no mean judge of these things, defined Helen as the best kind of honourable and tolerant issue politician. When he was describing how in her 20s she helped the Polish population of Fife to integrate into the local community. And that interest endured throughout her political career and was underlined by her role as the honorary patron of the Scottish-Bulgarian Association. We were also reminded yesterday at the funeral service that Helen could be stinging in her put-downs of political opponents, who could forget in June 2007 when she resigned two of her committee posts in protest at the appointment of a Conservative MSP as convener of the Equal Opportunities Committee. Helen described the move as putting Attila the Hun in charge of community care. But her commitment to social justice, it didn't ignore party boundaries, but it certainly transcended them. To give just two examples, Helen convened the cross-party group on industrial communities, reflecting that concern for the people and communities most seriously affected by mining closures and industrial decline. It was an issue she had real authority on, given her experience as a research assistant to her late father-in-law, Alec Eadie. I shared an upper committee corridor in the House of Commons with Alec. I remember him coming in one day and telling us we were breathing in dead air. It turned out to be right. The air conditioning system was attempting to suffocate the upper committee corridor, but Alec, with his practical experience of mining, recognised the problem straight away. So Helen came from a family background which gave her an insight into the coal industry and industrial communities that few had, and therefore it was entirely fitting her last speech in this chamber in September was on the harm caused by unrestored open-cast mine sites. Earlier this year, Helen served in the working group that Fergus Ewing chaired to provide and share information and support service for employees. Party affiliations weren't an issue. She was committed to doing the right thing and finding solutions for people who needed help. And Fergus testifies to Helen's approach, exemplary approach, to that cross-party basis of that committee. But most of all, the compassion apparent in her politics was part of her personality. That was the insight which Joanne Lamont correctly said from these wonderful photographs which were displayed at the funeral yesterday. Helen was a caring, dedicated and warm-hearted individual. That's why she was held in genuine affection across the political divide in this chamber. And that's why the tributes of the last week have been so numerous and so heartfelt. I hope it's of some comfort to our loved ones to know the high regard in which Helen was held by all members of this chamber, and she'll be sadly missed by every member of this chamber.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. The shocking suddenness of Helen's illness and loss has deprived Fife of one of its most dedicated servants in this chamber, of one of its most principled parliamentarians. And while we here in this place are rightly talking of Helen's contribution to politics and public life, I recognise that it is undoubtedly, as a wife, a mother, a grandmother and a friend, that Helen's loss will be most keenly felt. And I would like to extend the thoughts and prayers of myself and those of my party to Helen's family and to support this motion of condolence. In all of the tributes to Helen Eadie over the past few days, there have been two themes which have emerged. Firstly was Helen's fundamental care for people. Even as someone who perhaps didn't know Helen as well as other members in this chamber, it was evident to me that she was driven by a deep concern for others, be it her constituents, her colleagues or her family. This care for people and this desire to help others shaped much of Helen's career and many of her views. She was a vocal opponent of local government reorganisation, which introduced multi-member wards, largely because her experience as a councillor in Fife taught her that smaller wards allowed her to more effectively represent the interests of her constituents. Whether it was campaigning to improve the care of pensioners in Fife or working on behalf of the Polish and Bulgarian communities, Helen's priority was always her constituents, rather than her career or status as a politician. It seems strange in retrospect, but I was telling Joanne that when I first arrived here as an MSP, I was a little bit intimidated by Helen. I knew that she'd resigned several committees in protest that a Conservative could take any sort of leadership role in equal opportunities. I'd watched too as Helen would raise herself trembling in paroxysms of anti-Tory ire in the chamber on almost any given subject that you care to mention. And she caught me in the corridor a few weeks after I became leader. And I have to say that I thought that I was for it. But I wasn't, because in private, Helen was both warm and kind-hearted. And she'd stopped me to ask if I would pass a letter on to a UK Cabinet colleague, because she needed help to help others in her constituency, and would I oblige? It was not the only time that she asked me to help intervene on one issue or another on behalf of her constituents, and I always did, because her requests were so modest, her wish to help so heartfelt. They almost became personal missions to her, and she was always on the side of the weak, of the poor, of the people who just needed a big sister to wrap an arm around them and tell them, let's see if we can't make this better. And neither the letters that were exchanged nor the backdoor channels ever made it into the press, even when a situation wasn't resolved to Helen's liking, because she was much more keen to do whatever it took to help, rather than to grandstand or gain credit just for trying. Not everyone in this chamber can say the same thing. It has been spoken in newspaper tributes and at yesterday's funeral service, and here again today, that even when Helen was confined to her hospice bed, she insisted on carrying on her duties as a local MSP, replying to correspondence, sending instructions to her colleagues. And I hope you've all done what she asked. That sort of dedication is remarkable, but I don't think that it surprised anyone who knew Helen, as they wouldn't be able to imagine anything else. Because her life and her career were characterised by an absolute decency and honesty and integrity. We have lost too many of our class of 99 this year. And with every Scottish election, new people have the privilege to take their seats in this chamber. Helen was an example to all who came after her of what a people's representative should be, of how to put your constituents first, of how to show that while you can put your argument with force and passion in the chamber, but that as colleagues, no matter what the party, you can work with others to make a difference. The story of Helen's indignation and subsequent resignations at my colleague Margaret Mitchell taking on the chairmanship of the Equal Opportunities Committee is legend, and as the First Minister has already mentioned today, came with an accompanying withering comment about Attila the Hun. But what's less well known is that that same committee, under Margaret's guidance, produced a really in-depth report on women in prison and on their rights and on their treatment. And Helen sought Margaret out, specially, to tell her how fine a piece of work that it was and how important. And that was the other side, completely supportive and generous with her praise when she saw someone else standing up for the overlooked, for the oppressed and for the vulnerable. Helen had unshakable political convictions, a passion for expressing with full force her beliefs, and you would be hard-pushed to find a more decent, more honest or more principled parliamentarian than Helen Eadie. But for me, her abiding quality was to care for her constituents, to care for the difference that she could make, and to show care and respect for her opponents as well as her friends. As our thoughts and prayers go out to Bob, to Gemma, to Fiona and to the wider family at this time, we remember with affection one of Holyrood's most honourable members.
Will Rennie?
Yesterday at the service in Dalgety Bay, we sang a hymn, Will Your Anchor Hold? And the refrain was particularly apt yesterday. It talked about anchors that keep the soul, steadfast and sure while the billows roll, fastened to the rock that cannot move, grounded firm. That really, I thought, summed up Helen Eadie extremely well. She was very firm. No matter what happened around her, she was determined to carry on and achieve what she had set out to achieve. I shared a constituency with Helen for 4 years, so I saw firsthand the quality of service that she provided to her constituents. And it was therefore no surprise yesterday when I turned up at the service at Dalgety Bay. I thought early, but the hall was already packed. We had several rooms that we had to go into, and people stood outside. That, to me, showed the respect that people in the constituency, but also in the Labour Party, had for her. And she attracted the great and good of the Labour Party. I mean, to have the former Prime Minister making the tribute, to have her friend Baroness Ramsay to make such a personal contribution to the service, and Cathy Peaty to sing that beautiful song, but also her family to make a reading during the service, showed that she had so many dimensions to her life. There was clear affection from her constituents. And I too, actually, like Ruth Davidson and many others, feared Helen Eadie. It wasn't a secret that she didn't really like Liberal Democrats. She didn't like Jim Tolson. Now. And she didn't like me, I don't think, too often, certainly my views on proportional representation. I don't think she was the greatest fan of the coalition between ourselves and Labour, and she certainly let you know it. I think the last speech in this Parliament, I think she accused me of several things in that debate. But the very next day, she was out being kind and warm and smiling with that huge grin that she had. That put you at immediate ease. She was able to separate the personal from the political. And some of us find that quite hard because we have great passion for our politics, but not Helen. She could separate the two. I remember campaigning in Cardenden in the Glenrothes by-election. It was bucketing down with rain, and this car screeched a halt. Bob was in the driving seat, and Helen bounced out and berated me about my latest misdemeanour in the constituency. But again, the next day, big smile, kind heart, recognising that we were politicians together and we had a battle together. She was colourful as well. I laughed so many times, so fondly, at some of her enterprises, her demand on the Equal Opportunities Committee, her escapade in Cowdenbeath with the young people where she challenged them in the estate and managed to escape, calling for a curfew in Cowdenbeath, but also her one-woman campaign to ban the amber traffic light, to bring Scotland in line with Bulgaria, which she loved so much. But she wasn't afraid of sticking out, of saying things different, of being colourful. And we need colourful politicians like Helen, who contribute so much. Helen, I mean, I'm not a socialist. Helen was clearly a socialist. But she inspired me for her commitment to socialism. Never cynical at all, always believing, always being optimistic, driven, passionate, optimistic, caring for her constituents. I saw it firsthand as an MP in the constituency. I saw that she was there first before I was on an issue. She cared and she delivered results in it. She was a warm personality with that huge big grin that she had. Helen, today we're celebrating your life. This is about you today, Helen, and if you're watching, I hope you appreciate it. Thank you.
Margaret MacDonald.
The paths of my family and Helen's family crossed a long time ago. Ali Keady was the candidate in Ayr, and my husband Jim was his election agent. That's a team, if you can just imagine it. And then when Jim was elected to Westminster, he went to live with Helen. Now, that's something that not everybody knows. But he was there with a clutch of young MPs, and she was the landlady. And he said, even then, you know, the characteristic was one of kindness and consideration. And everybody has spoken of that today in here, Helen's kindness and her consideration. But I was also glad to hear that people spoke about the fact that she could do one. If she heard some of the things I said about Europe and EFTA, she did one. But I appreciated her because she was that rare animal. She was loyal to her party, and yet she walked to the beat of her own drum. And I thought it was quite a difficult feat to pull off. She was a very admirable woman. She was a serious woman. A lot of people didn't realise how serious Helen Eadie was, but she was a mine of information in Europe, for example, because she took the research very, very seriously. She didn't read the top pages the way most of us do. I'll think that we'll miss her in the Parliament because she was so obviously a good person. She sought nothing more than to pursue what she saw as righteousness and people getting a fair deal. And in that, I admired her because she was never knocked off that course. So I think her intention in politics was to do good. She succeeded.
Thank you. Can I advise members that there is a book of condolence in the black and white corridor if members wish to sign it, and we will make sure it is passed on to the family as soon as practicable. I now allow a short period of suspension before we move to this afternoon's business. The Parliament will resume at 2:45.
The next item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 8348 in the name of Joanne Lamont on the future of the defence industry in Scotland. I'd be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could press the request to speak buttons now, and advise members that we are tight for time over all the debates this afternoon. I call on Joanne Lamont to speak to and move the motion. 14 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am proud to rise to speak in this debate, and in doing so move the motion in my name. In 2011, as a consequence of the reorganisation of the Scottish Parliament boundaries, I was elected to represent the area covering the Govan shipyard, a privilege I know my predecessors Nicola Sturgeon and Gordon Jackson took very seriously. Across the water, Bill Kidd was given the same honour for the Scotstoun Yard. Indeed, one of his predecessors, the late Donald Dewar, said in the opening of this Parliament, "In the quiet moments today, we might hear some echoes from the past, the shout of the welder in the din of the great Clyde shipyards." These twin centres of Clyde shipbuilding and their sister yard in Rosyth are a source of great pride, not just to those of us lucky enough to represent them, but all of us who have a sense of Scottish history, an interest in our country's industrial heritage, and the desire to create and retain high-skilled, well-paid jobs for our fellow Scots. Those black and white pictures of armies of...
Gil Patterson.
I much appreciate the opportunity and that intervention you've given me, Joanne Lamont. I wonder if you think that democracy is an urgent thing for everybody in the world, and I wonder if how you would comment on the representative now in Parliament for Govan who has threatened the workers if they exercise a democratic right to vote for perhaps independence or not, that they would lose their jobs in their livelihood.
Ian Davison stands second to none in championing the interests of shipyard workers. He's fought to secure jobs in the face of the threat placed on them by his commitment, this party's commitment, to separate Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. And perhaps they should be a little more honest about what the prospectus is. Those black and white pictures of armies of working-class men flooding in and out of the shipyard gates, bending steel and metal against a backdrop of cranes and docks, building these floating marvels, are iconic images which are integral to Glasgow and Scotland's history. Jimmy Reid famously said, "We don't only build ships, we build men." And you only have to listen to two of those great men, Sir Alec Ferguson and Billy Connolly, to get a sense of the pride felt about these workplaces and the special people who made up the workforce. The fact that we in Scotland possess these amazing skills and expertise, once the envy of the world, is a source of great pride to all of us. Sadly, our competitors in other countries didn't just sit back and admire what we did in Scotland and across the United Kingdom. They too learned how to build these amazing ships. They invested in these industries and found any competitive edge they could to take us on at this game. At one point in the early 1900s, the Clyde built 1/5 of the world's ships, and at its peak, shipbuilding in Scotland employed 100,000 people. Scotland still has a proud shipbuilding industry, but it's not what it once was. We know that. The days of thousands of young men leaving school and walking into an apprenticeship the very next day in the shipyards have gone. Yet this is still a key industry for Scotland, not just providing thousands of jobs, but with them good wages and high skills to boot. The decision to go ahead with the aircraft carriers, ordered by a Labour Prime Minister from Fife, may have been viewed as controversial in some quarters, but not by the thousands of men and women who set about this mammoth project in the knowledge it would provide for their families in the coming years. It was a lifeline for those workers, but it was a project with a clear end date, and sadly that end date is close. There will no longer be enough work on the Clyde to sustain the workforce at its present capacity. For the 800 workers affected, that they knew this day would come, but that makes it no less of a blow to them and to our shipbuilding industry. In responding to the news from the Defence Secretary earlier this month, the Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said much I would agree with. Yes, we are all saddened for the proud shipbuilders in Portsmouth, and we remember the solidarity across the workforce wherever they are based. It is beyond argument that there has been a steady decline in our shipbuilding industry over a long number of years, which should worry us all. I too am concerned about a reliance on naval contracts and the uncertainty which comes from the gaps in those order books.
Minister.
Joanne Lamont for taking the intervention and ask her, in the context of that last point she made about the decline in shipbuilding jobs, does she believe that the promises to make the peace dividend pay for jobs in Scotland through the ending of the Cold War, or that Trident is a useful exercise in terms of government expenditure, are both missed opportunities in terms of safeguarding shipbuilding
Joanne
jobs?
Lamont.
I'm not very clear what the point is that the Minister is making. What we have to recognise, and which this government has actually done nothing about, they spoke last week about diversification only after this crisis emerged, rather than doing the work of government in the long period beforehand. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has my full support in exploring any diversification routes we can to move on from this dependence on the MOD for thousands of jobs, although it would appear that BA are an obstacle to that. They do a very particular kind of job, and that is what they want to continue doing. Perhaps we could have done more. We all knew this day would come. Maybe we should have come together, cross-party, cross-government, long before now, and attempted to map a long-term future for our shipbuilding industry. But it's not too late. We stand ready to engage in that debate, to learn from our neighbours the way they once did from us, to help manage any change and exploit future opportunities from the world-class skills and facilities we have in the Clyde and Rosyth and in our defence industries. If Germany and our other neighbours in Europe can compete at the high end with the Koreas and Chinas, then let us understand what we have to do too. Let's get round the table with the UK Government, the management and the trade unions, and work together to save our shipyards. Call it a summit, a commission, a task force, whatever. They will have my full support and that of the Scottish Labour Party. But we must recognise that any change cannot and will not happen overnight. A diversification plan will take many years and much investment to implement. Scotland will not become world leaders in shipbuilding just by sheer will alone or because the SNP say so. And if we are to have a future in shipbuilding, it can only be possible by retaining the skills and capacity we currently have in Scotland. If those workers leave the shipyard's gate with no prospect of returning anytime soon, then the skills that have been passed down the generations will be lost with them. There will be no one to teach the next generation how Scots built ships. That one thing we have, our skills, will be lost. And if we are to retain those skills, we need to keep these jobs in the Clyde, and no matter how inconvenient it is for some, there is only one game in town. Our only option of bridging the gap between the carrier project that kept Govan and Scotstoun open and any future plans for shipbuilding is naval contracts. Make no mistake, if they dry up, the skills and capacity in the Clyde will go with them and Scotland will be lost to the shipbuilding industry. That is a prospect which no one in this chamber wants. Now, we do have serious prospect of more naval contracts coming to the Clyde. Philip Hammond announced 3 ocean patrol vehicles and, of course, the big prize, Type 26 frigates. He has also insisted that, despite the conspiracy theorists, the Clyde is the best place in the United Kingdom to build those ships. On commercial grounds, there is no contest. There is now only one barrier to the future of Scottish shipbuilding, and that is the referendum on Scottish independence. Let us be absolutely clear. Let us be absolutely clear. Complex warships like the Type 26 frigates will not be built in an independent Scotland. Common sense tells you that governments of any stripe will ensure that high-end defence projects would be built within their own territories.
Check Brodie. Could we have Check Brodie's microphone?
Sorry. Is the member saying that a commercial decision, which is recognised, of investing over £300 million has been taken by a company on the basis of whatever constitutional arrangement there might be? They've never said that.
Joanne Lamont.
The exception applies precisely because we're inside the United Kingdom, and that's the basis on which the procurement... You can't wish it away. You cannot wish it away. It is the best place inside the United Kingdom. If we are not in the United Kingdom, please. That contract will not be let to an independent Scotland. Now, I have acknowledged Nicola Sturgeon's work and commitment with the shipyards she once acted for. I accept that she will have a good understanding of the challenges this industry faces. So I am at a loss to some of the wild misrepresentations she has offered over the last few weeks. She says the Clyde is the only place where we can build these ships now. Putting aside that she argued her case even when Portsmouth was still open. She knows that the UK Government has made it clear that these decisions are reversible and that Portsmouth could be fired in plenty of time to take on this work should Scotland leave the United Kingdom. She says that the UK Government currently orders warships from Korea and collaborates with Australia on defence projects. The UK Government ordered a tanker from Korea and worked with the Australians on design work. And it is the lack of candour and honesty which has been the hallmark of the SNP's approach to the referendum. They tell us that there are no consequences, no downside to a yes vote, even when it comes to people's jobs. So for the avoidance of doubt, let us be clear. If Scotland votes yes next year, it will be the death knell of a proud industry. And it's not defeatism, it is the real world. Come and join. If you don't believe me, come and join the people in the real world who work in the industry. John Dolan of Scotstoun. It is quite clear if Scotland votes yes, we will not be building ships for the United Kingdom. Raymond Dogood of Rosyth. Listen to the men who work in the industry. We know what you think. You should understand what the people in the shipyards think. If Scotland was independent, no one in Scotland could bid to build Type 26.
Mr Patterson, order, please.
Yes, decimate it. Duncan McPhee of Scotstoun said we would be greatly reduced or completely finished as a shipbuilding industry. John Wall of the Confederation of Shipbuilding Unions said there is no way on God's earth in my mind that under an independent Scotland we will any longer be in the fight. Eric MacLeod, GMB convener at Babcock Marine Rosyth, said no UK Ministry of Defence means no more shipbuilding jobs in Scotland.
Mr MacDonald, could you sit down, please?
Foretold, we have heard the shout of the welder in the din of the Great Clyde shipyards, and it is time the Scottish Government listened. They speak out to protect their industry. You may condemn me. You ought to listen to what these men have to say about the consequences of that vote. When people come to vote on September the 18th next year, they will do so for many reasons, and this may be a factor. And I suspect that there are people on the government benches who do care about the shipbuilding industry, but privately accept that the closure of the shipyards would happen and is a price worth paying in order for Scotland to be independent. But the least they should do, the least they can do, is be honest with the people they represent about the consequences of that decision. Jobs in the Clyde is not the reason I support the United Kingdom. I believe our argument is far deeper and richer. But I have to say to you, in all seriousness, had I been a nationalist in these past few weeks, then I'm sure I would have at least paused for reflection that my commitment to my political project was going to come at the cost of people's jobs. At least be honest and tell them you may lose these shipbuilding jobs, but it is a price worth paying for Scotland to be
Order,
separate.
Please. Order. Final minutes, Ms Lamont.
The fact of the matter is, in this debate, the people within the industry tell us the consequence, and the people who support independence tell them we should not listen to those voices in the industry. That is unacceptable. If we cannot speak truth to power, what is the point of this chamber, and what is the point of trade unionists who are committed to their industry saying what they believe to be the consequences? Because, of course, there may be good things about independence, and people are entitled to their view, and I am certain there is a downside. But how can we have a real debate on our country's future in this climate when we are not even permitted to give voice to those who understand the industry, who understand the consequences, and are asking those who promote this project to explain what they would do instead? The people of Scotland deserve honesty. The people who earn their living in the shipyards deserve honesty about their future. Let's hope we can have some honesty from the government today.
Before I call the Minister, I want to remind the Chamber that whether debates can be robust and people can have opinions on all sides of the debate, but debates must be conducted with respect across the Chamber for members for each other. And I do hope the debate will continue now in that fashion. Ordered, please, for the rest of the afternoon. I now call point of order, Neil Finlay.
I wonder if it is in order for a member to shout, "You are a disgrace to Scotland," to a member who is defending our constituency interests and who has a long record of defending our constituency interests. I wonder if you could rule on that.
I think I've just made the point to the Chamber that members must be respectful of each other. That is what it says in the standing orders, and therefore we should all reflect on that for the rest of this debate. Further point of order, Neil Finlay.
I wonder if you would therefore allow the opportunity for that member to withdraw that disgraceful comment.
Order, please. I have made the point from the Chair that members should be respectful of each other. That is what it says in the standing orders. I now expect this debate to continue in that fashion. We have now lost time from the debate. Can I tell the Chamber that? So I will now be extremely strict with time for all members. I call Keith Brown to speak to and move Amendment 8348.3. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, it is perhaps worth remembering that this debate takes place against the background of the anxiety and insecurity of 835 people who are set to lose their jobs and livelihoods at Govan, Scotstoun, Rosyth and Filton, as well as the 1,110 jobs, including 170 agency workers who don't feature in the motion from Joanne Lamont, which are to be lost at Portsmouth. No, I won't. Our thoughts are with all of those workers, and I think it's worth taking some time to think about that. Many of these workers, indeed, and their trade unions have asked, some have even pleaded, that their plight is not used as a political football. And yet, only a fortnight after that date, we have this motion from Joanne Lamont coming forward. Not only that, but it's also worth saying that the Deputy Leader, her Deputy Leader said, let's not make this a constitutional issue. That's what her Deputy Leader said. Worse still, on the very day of the announcement that was made, Joanne Lamont rushed to the radio to blurt out that it's self-evident this decision is part of the union dividend. The 1,110 jobs and 835 jobs being lost, part of the union dividend. And it's that proposition and Joanne Lamont's obsession with Westminster control over these affairs that everything is better under Westminster that I seek to challenge today. While Joanne Lamont saw this news as her latest opportunity to bang the drum for Westminster control over these decisions, we should contrast the approach that's been taken by the Scottish Government. The focus of John Swinney, Nicola Sturgeon and the First Minister has been on working with the trade unions, the workforce and the management to safeguard as many jobs as possible and to help place those who need them into new jobs and to support the workforce. So is Joanne Lamont right that the UK is good for defence jobs?
Minister, could you resume your seat? I have a point of order. Mr Drew-Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister draws attention to the efforts of the Scottish Government to protect employment. Can he indicate to the Chamber why there is no Employment Minister, never mind any of the ministers mentioned, even present in this debate to do it? Why is the Transport Minister responding to this debate about employment in my region? This is not a point of order. And I have to say that over recent weeks I have noticed when members have not been able to get interventions on speeches in all sides of the Chamber, they've been making points of order in the middle of speeches. It's not particularly respectful to their fellow members. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So we're asking the question whether Joanne Lamont's right that the UK is good for defence jobs. And I think to test that proposition, if you can look at three particular projects. First of all, the two aircraft carriers which Joanne Lamont mentioned, only one of which, of course, will be operational, and that will take nearly a decade after the last time the UK had aircraft carriers. One of which will be held in what's called extended readiness, or what most of us would call mothballs. And the budget for both of which, the taxpayer was told by the Labour Party, would cost £3.6 billion. This has now been, I think, in the common technology, the common language of Philip Hammond, as re-baselined. To the rest of us, that means the budget's been blown out the water, and it's now £6.2 billion for those two aircraft carriers. No, I won't. I've been delayed enough already, I think. UK defence procurement, I think, is a shambles, Presiding Officer. Let's look at the Nimrod MRA4 project, costing up to £3.6 billion. The Money paid for that was also taken over by a £500,000 commission. That's £3.6 billion for the cost of the Nimrods, a £500,000 commission to scrap the Nimrods, and we got for that the scrap value of £1 million. So cost £3.6 billion. We have no Nimrod aircraft to show for that. And of course, we also had, in relation to that project, 100 civilian job losses. UK defence procurement is a mess and it's losing us jobs. And a third project, I should say in relation first of all to that second project, Joanne Lamont quoted a number of trade union leaders. I would quote Bernie Hamilton, a national trade union leader, who said of the Nimrod project, "The lunatics have taken over the asylum. The decision is a betrayal of the workers. UK defence procurement is not good for workers in Scotland." Or let's take the Labour Party's £150 million award of a contract for 2 ships at Swan Hunter in 2000. They finally cost over twice as much as they were intended to cost, £342 million. They were years late. They had to be moved from Swan Hunter to the Clyde. And one of the ships, the RFA Large Bay, was then sold to Australia for £65 million after only 4 years in service. UK defence procurement is a shambles and it's costing jobs. Yes, I will give away.
Joanne Lamont.
Sturgeon and I agreed that sustaining the jobs in the Clyde was a good thing. This minister seems to be suggesting that it was a bad thing, and if we do lose the jobs in a year's time, well, this is a bad thing anyway. Could you clarify whether you think the decision in the Clyde was a good thing for the Clyde or not, notwithstanding, as I have said on many occasions, the direct consequence and impact on those people who have lost their jobs?
Minister.
Yeah, I think just inventing things that I've said is probably not the best way to advance your argument. I've never said it's a bad thing to lose jobs in the Clyde. The contrast, though, is with our division for the defence industry, and within that, the shipbuilding industry in Scotland, which stands in stark contrast to the UK's record of massive cost overruns, projects delivered years late when they're not delivered, sometimes not delivered at all, and the managed, very badly managed decline of jobs. In less than 20 years, to come back to the point that Joanne Lamont just made, the UK has seen Scotland's shipbuilding workforce decline by 35%. That's some union dividend supported by the Labour Party. For our part, we would take the missed opportunities to diversify. Joanne Lamont says she doesn't understand the point with diversification. She may remember the commitments her own party gave at the end of the Cold War to diversify defence jobs, which never happened. And the other point I was making is that the £100 billion cost of Trident could much more properly be spent on traditional defence procurement to the benefit of jobs in Scotland. An independent Scotland will not require £6.2 billion aircraft carriers. We will need to address the fact, though, that not a single major Royal Naval surface vessel is in Scotland at this time. We have a coastline that's longer than India's, and the UK has left Scotland very poorly protected. Just as BA have recognised the unique skills of the workforce on the Clyde and at Scotland, we will work with the company to safeguard and build upon this expertise. Babcock, of course, already diversifying to renewables. Tala is also another company in Joanne Lamont's constituency, already working with the Scottish Government on transport projects. We can do better than the UK Government has done. The Scottish Government is working hard to support the industry in identifying new markets, capitalising on our real strengths in highly advanced complex warship design and fabrication. We are currently determining our defence procurement needs, and those decisions, alongside support for international trade, would support the long-term future of the yards. I know that hundreds of BA staff are working with Babcock at Rosyth to complete the assembly programme for the aircraft carriers. These companies are hugely important. I've lost a lot of time already to the Scottish economy. As well as diversification, we need to see a change in defence technologies driven by new forms of combat that has led to changes in product design and manufacture across the defence industry. So I've mentioned Thales. We could also mention Celix ES. We do have faith in the Government, in the ingenuity and the expertise of defence workers in Scotland. And Joanne Lamont says the big threat to that is the referendum. Well, on this point, we perhaps agree. The referendum to take the UK out of the European Union is a far greater threat to defence jobs in Scotland than any referendum of Scotland's independence. The uncertainty of that referendum, especially for companies like Thales and Celix, which are actually headquartered in Europe, is surely a concern for these companies. But we never had any mention of that mentioned by the Labour Party. In relation to the Type 26 contract, the approach of the new campaign seems to be totally different from the approach of the Scottish Government. The No campaign want to put the brakes on the Type 26 contract coming to the Clyde in the event of a yes vote. Now, the brakes that they want to put are not ABS brakes. They want to put an ABS twist on this. They want to have anywhere but Scotland being promoted for these projects. They're happy for the UK to consider working collaboratively with Australia, India, Canada, Turkey and the United States. Indeed, Joanne Lamont now supports the most sensitive and dangerous piece of defence equipment, Trident nuclear weapons,
Mr Rennie, the Minister's not giving way.
Being procured from, leased from and owned by a foreign power. But she will not trust the same workers that are working on these contracts just now to work on these contracts after Scotland votes for independence. Scottish workers are currently building these UK warships. They've shown their ability over many years. The decision taken, despite what is said by Joanne Lamont, as is said, in fact, by Philip Dunn, the UK Defence Minister, was taken on business grounds, nothing to do with a referendum. That's why the business has come to Scotland in the first place. And what we've now seen, of course, is her local MP, Ian Davidson, actually dreaming up and now advocates a break clause to deny the Yards in his own constituency the Type 26 contracts should Scotland, in what Jamie Webster calls a democratic vote, decide to vote for independence. No, I can't. If Scotland were to vote yes, this is the words of Alistair Carmichael, since Willie Rennie was trying to speak. If Scotland were to vote yes, you would think that Portsmouth would be well placed in that circumstance. We have the Secretary of State for Scotland promoting Portsmouth as the place that should get the Type 26 contracts. Now, I know that Alistair Carmichael got his job in a hurry, but surely he should have checked his job description first. His job is meant to promote Scotland in the Cabinet, not promote the Cabinet here in Scotland. He should defend these Scottish jobs, and it's a disgrace he hasn't done so. I will do.
Willie Rennie.
Can the Minister tell me how many British warships have been built outside Britain since the Second World War, and can he name each and every one of them?
Minister, and I'm reimbursing you 30 seconds.
I've already answered that point. I don't intend to go back to it. But to conclude, Presiding Officer, on the point that Joanne Lamont made,
Order,
Joanne Lamont said at one stage that we should work together. Joanne Lamont said at one stage that we should work together and get round the table. I wrote to Joanne Lamont on the 25th of June asking for her to work with me to provide the reassurances required to make sure the Type 26 contract came to govern. I wrote to her on the 25th of June. She's never even bothered to respond. That shows her commitment to these jobs, Presiding Officer. And to conclude with a quote from Jamie Webster, the union convener of the Govan Yard, in relation to the Type 26 contract. Jamie Webster has said himself that it would be the result of a democratic vote. In that context, everybody in Scotland, every politician for whichever section, should work to hell and back to safeguard the jobs at Govan and on the Clyde. I say, from my point of view, this is one politician that will work after a yes vote to ensure those jobs stay on the Clyde, and I think every other politician in this chamber should do the same, and I have proposed the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to and move Amendment 8348.1. 6 minutes, Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity this afternoon to debate the defence industry in Scotland. The Scottish defence industry is one of our highest value industry sectors, employs nearly 40,000 people and is underpinned by the world's fourth largest defence budget, that of the Ministry of Defence. In my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, we have great companies like Raytheon in Glenrothes with more than 500 people employed. Rolls-Royce have a presence in Dunfermline and elsewhere in Scotland. Vector Aerospace are in Perth. We have Babcock's in Rosyth working on the aircraft carriers. Elsewhere in Scotland, great companies like Selec, Thales, Kinetic and, of course, BAE Systems on the Clyde. All of these, of course, companies are relying on exporting, but they are underpinned by UK domestic contracts from the Ministry of Defence, and they are key components in the Scots economy. And the jobs they support are very often well-paid, highly skilled and much sought after. And anything that threatens them, we should be very concerned about. Yes, I'll give way.
Margot MacDonald.
I wonder if the member is in any way concerned that we should be concentrating on defence work for the Clyde when we know that the Ministry of Defence is going to be cutting back even more on the size of the Navy.
Murdo Fraser.
Margaret MacDonald makes a perfectly fair point about the long-term future prospects for the Clyde, and John Lamont, I thought, touched on this very effectively in our contribution, talking about the need in the long term to diversify. But, of course, we need to deal with what's happening in the next 2, 5, 10 years, which is why the Type 26 frigate contracts are going to be so important. Now, the new development that the debate touches on, I need to make some progress, Mr Rennie, if I can, is the new development is the BAE announcement of job cuts. And I think Keith Brown was entirely right to concentrate on the fact that this is very bad news for people in Portsmouth, and it is bad news for many of those employed in Govan. But it does mean that Govan will have a future. And we should welcome that. And we should also welcome the fact that the UK government has proactively brought forward 3 new offshore patrol vessels to fill the gap in work between completion of the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers and the new frigates. And that is the point covered in my amendment this afternoon. The key issue in this debate, though, is what happens in the event that there is a yes vote in the referendum. And the simple fact here is that no UK government since the Second World War has ever had a complex warship built in any foreign country. That is the answer to Willie Rennie's question that the Minister could not bring himself to answer at that point. And post the referendum, if Scotland votes yes, Scotland will be a foreign country, and the contracts for those frigates, we know, will not be signed until after September next year. Why would the government... Yes, I'll give way briefly, yes.
Maureen Mott.
I thank the member for giving way. Does he accept that it was BAE Systems who made this decision, not the government, and they will have taken the future of Scotland, whatever it be, into account?
Murdo Fraser.
Of course it was BAE Systems who made that decision, but it's the UK government that will make the final decision as to where these contracts are placed. Now, why would the UK government break with convention and place these contracts anywhere out with their own home country? Now, let's just pose a question, if we can, to the SNP benches. Let's just imagine, in an independent country, would the government of an independent country with a shipbuilding capacity in Scotland ever place a warship contract out with Scotland? No, it is utterly inconceivable that would ever happen. Can you imagine if Keith Brown was the Minister for Defence Procurement, coming to this chamber in the event... I've given way twice already.
Order, please.
Can you imagine him coming to this chamber, announcing the fact that a warship contract was to be built somewhere other than Scotland and Scottish jobs being lost? It would never happen in a million years. So why would it happen in the rest of the UK? I'm not giving way, I've made that clear. Why would that happen in the rest of the UK post-independence? Can you imagine the political reaction in the House of Commons if the Secretary of State for Defence got up and said, we're going to place these contracts in a foreign country? Can you imagine the reaction from the representatives from Portsmouth and from elsewhere if that were the case? It is utterly inconceivable, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, I've given way twice already.
The member has said
you'll have your chance,
way.
Mr Hepburn. Now, we'll hear, I'm sure, in this debate about the situation in Norway, and we heard this from the Deputy First Minister the other week about Norway. The most advanced frigate in the Norwegian Navy is the Nansen-class frigate, currently being built in Spain, a £2.4 billion euro contract. Now, they do build ships in Norway for the offshore oil industry, that is true, but globally, new ship orders in 2012 were at their lowest since 1998. It's a difficult competitive market. And yes, we should be looking to diversify, but we should not underestimate just how difficult that is going to be when we see commercial vessels required in Scotland today being built in the Far East and elsewhere. And of course, if we're interested in diversification, the real question is, why didn't we start before now? Why was the Scottish Government not making the efforts with a task force before today to start this very important work? And I thought it was telling, Deputy Presiding Officer, that in his comments and in his amendment to the motion, Mr Brown fell back on that old stalwart whenever the SNP are in trouble, and that is referencing Trident. Trident money has been spent again. I make it, according to my calculations, 20 times already that Trident money has been spent. Well, today we have it spent for the 21st time, this time on defence procurement. And of course, what Mr Brown forgets is that Trident already supports jobs in Scotland, and if he scraps that programme, those jobs would be lost. Deputy Presiding Officer, despite the protestations from the SNP benches, it is absolutely clear that the future of Govan is threatened by independence. Those jobs are under threat if people vote yes in the referendum in September next year. That's why I support the Labour motion and I move my amendment.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of a maximum of 6 minutes, and I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I just say at the outset that my heart goes out to all those workers who have lost their jobs, notwithstanding that we are currently part of the United Kingdom, and I think particularly of those in Govan, Scots and Rosyth, and of course very much in Portsmouth. And it is quite right and proper that the Scottish Government's first priority will be the workers who face redundancy in Scotland, and a focus therefore on the support of the PACE programme in helping to find alternative employment for these very skilled workers. Turning to the Labour motion before us today, Presiding Officer, I find it very encouraging indeed that there is a recognition that Scotland's defence industry already plays a significant role, not just at the UK level, but also further afield at the European level and indeed globally. And to what can we ascribe that success to? Well, I would submit that it is indeed the skills of the workforce on the Clyde, at Rosyth and in our many electronic and high-tech defence companies, many of them listed today by Murdo Fraser. And that has ensured that our industries have had an important role to play and will continue to have an important role to play firth of our borders. And indeed, as far as the Clyde yards are concerned, the terms of the BA press release of 6 November are worth noting, and I quote, BA Systems has agreed with the UK Ministry of Defence that Glasgow would be the most effective location for the manufacture of the future Type 26 ships. The press release went on to say, and I quote, the company proposes to consolidate its shipbuilding operations in Glasgow with investments in facilities to create a world-class capability, positioning it to deliver an affordable Type 26 programme for the Royal Navy. This vote of confidence in the Clyde was not based on sentiment, but on hard commercial considerations reflecting the excellence of the workforce and the significant experience and principal location of the key design team in terms of naval architects and naval engineers. And hence it is quite clear going forwards that it will be this rationale that will determine where these Type 26 ships will be built. Now, no less an authority than the Chief of Defence Staff General, Sir Nicholas Houghton, has confirmed when speaking on the Andrew Marr programme of Sunday, 7th November, and he said with respect to the fact that the Westminster Government will, and I quote, get our ships in the place it makes the most sense. He went on to say also that the BA decision, AE decision was, and I quote, very much a matter of business rationalisation. In terms of raw business sense, it makes sense. The place there, they have the greatest capacity and the best depth of skills, which is on the Clyde, so it is driven by a business decision.
Joanne Lamont can explain to me why she quotes so extensively from the person she has quoted from and chooses to ignore the words from the conveners in Scotstoun, in Govan and in Rosyth, who are telling her that the consequence of this vote next year will be jobs on the Clyde. They say it. Why would you not listen to them when you're prepared to quote the man who happens to agree with you?
I think quoting the Chief of the Defence Staff is perhaps not irrelevant in the context of this debate. I would remind, though, the member of what Jamie Webster said. If the situation is that Scottish people by democratic vote yes, I would expect, no, sorry, demand that every single politician of every section supports us to hell and back. I don't think it can be any clearer than the convener of the Govan Shipyard Union. To continue, Presiding Officer, we can also look at what the UK Defence Secretary of State, when announcing the closure of Portsmouth shipbuilding facilities, didn't say, though he was repeatedly asked to do so. And he didn't say, he refused to contemplate that the cancellation of the Type 26 orders from the Clyde in the event of a yes vote next year would, in fact, take place. So there we have it. The ships will be built where it makes the most sense to do so. That is the key political message coming from the UK Secretary of State for Defence, the Chief of the Defence Staff, and that is the only conclusion that makes any commercial sense. Of course, I'm sorry, I must make progress. Of course, it is moreover now the case that the Clyde will be the only place on these isles with the capacity to build large complex warships. And one final element with respect to this particular case is to do with, of course, the procurement rules. And if anybody reads Article 346, it is quite clear that Member States are allowed to take measures they consider necessary for the protection of their essential security interests as far as military procurement as defined is concerned. And hence, if the rest of the UK Government considered it necessary for the protection of its essential security interest to award a contract to BAE, and BAE in turn could complete that contract where it felt it was most economically advantageous to do so, there would be absolutely no restriction as a matter of EU law on it doing so.
Members in their last minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So we have had this factually confirmed also by Andrew Morrison, who is the current Minister for International Security Strategy at Westminster. So I really feel that on the basis of the evidence before us, we have to conclude that decisions are made on the basis of hard commercial facts. They're made on the basis of what would be in the interest of the rest of the UK. Where is the expertise? The expertise is on the Clyde. So really, Presiding Officer, to me, it is a no-brainer. It's quite clear from an examination of the facts that naval procurement in Scotland will continue, and that with respect to the Type 26 ships, that these will indeed be built on the Clyde. What are the Scots to believe, Presiding Officer? Logical argument or the Labour Party's project fear? I know where I put my faith in, Presiding Officer, the good sense of the people of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Willie Rennie to be followed by Michael McMahon.
This announcement was not a surprise. Those who are aware of the movements, the ebbs and flows of the defence sector, of the warship sector, will be aware that this day was coming. After the huge activity with the aircraft carriers and the Type 45 destroyers, the Type 26 and the OPVs was never going to make up for the activity at the height of that construction. So this day was not a surprise, but it's still been hard for the workers involved. The real question is why it's taken this event before the government has woken up to the need to diversify. I have been asking questions in Rosyth, because I cover the Rosyth dockyard, I covered it at Westminster as well. I've been asking questions for years about diversification. Why has that not been done by the Scottish Government for the Clyde? It seems to take a crisis before this government takes any action at all. Also, the members, they're making a brave attempt at this, but sovereign capability has been a principle that has been established within the Ministry of Defence and the UK government, not just now, and the UK government since the Second World War. We have not built any warships outside of the UK. The vessels that have gone to Korea were fuel tankers. They weren't warships. They were built over there on a commercial contract, not just now. We have protected land war vehicles, warships, network-enabled capability and fixed-wing aircraft. That is regarded as sovereign capability. Why do we think the SNP, just because they say so, is going to change decades of UK government policy? The yards in Portsmouth will not be closed, not just now. The yard in Portsmouth will not be closed until after the referendum, and it's no coincidence that that is the case. The orders for the Type 26 frigates will not be placed until after the referendum. The UK government are defending our own defence interest. That is the reality. Yes, go on.
Minister.
Can I just refer Willie Rennie to thank him first of all for taking intervention and refer him to the comments of his Lib Dem leader of Portsmouth City Council, who said in March 2012 that if a decision was taken within the next year, the skills will have gone. The jobs can't go to Portsmouth. That's your own Lib Dem leader saying that. Do you not have faith in the Scottish workers on the Clyde to take on this job? Or do you think you would pay an expensive premium to go elsewhere?
Willie Rennie, can all members speak through the chair, please?
I think I know Gerald Vernon-Jackson a little bit more than Keith Brown does, and I know that he is standing up for Portsmouth. But the reality, if the Minister, and I'm sure he's read the statement in detail, and I'm sure he's discussed it with Philip Hammond, he will know that the orders for the Type 26 and the Portsmouth Yard will not close until after the referendum. That is the reality. It will not be closed. And if you look at Barrow, Keep Barrow Afloat campaign that has been established, they are arguing that in addition to the submarines, there should be a shipyard capability constructed in Barrow. It's got the ability to do so, but everybody else seems to ignore that reality. Go on, Chick Brodie.
Chick Brodie.
Hear about all this was about localisation and where ships will be built and not be built. And I know the member said there was an inconsistency between the SNP's demands to build British warships at the same time as endorsing the Scottish Global Forum report, which he says recommended buying anything but British. But of course we now have
a letter.
Hurry you along. We have a letter saying it's important to observe that the conclusions you appear to draw from our work are not an accurate reflection of our findings.
Willie Rennie.
I thank Chick Brodie for taking up half my speech. If he actually looks in detail at the report, it actually refers to Danish vessels. It talks about New Zealand, Irish, Norwegian Navy, German class. It talks about anything but British warships. And this report has been endorsed by the SNP. So one week they say, let's buy British, and the next week they say, let's buy anything but the British. And Chick Brodie should read the report more carefully. But what we have here is a range of contradictions. A range of contradictions. We have the SNP condemning British foreign policy, numerous occasions, but demanding to build that British government's warships and all its vehicles. Just like they campaigned for the Trident refit facility to be constructed in Rosyth, in my constituency. They want these weapons of mass destruction, as they would call them, to be in tip-top condition, ready for war at any time, because they are prepared to put their principles to one side if it means this case. This is the contradiction that we face with the SNP. We've heard about buy British, but then buy anything but the British. We say we could be like Norway, but we oppose Norway's policy on the EU, which subject Britain to the EU competition rules. But we've also got Nicola Sturgeon telling us in 2005 that the fisheries protection vessels should be reclassed as warships so they can be built in this country, but expecting the UK government to do the exact opposite. Are they suggesting the Type 45 destroyers or the Type 26 should be reclassified as fishing vessels in the future? Is that the kind of contorted logic and the Ministry of Defence that we would expect in an independent Scotland? The reality is that the SNP have been found wanting on the shipyards. They do not understand how the British foreign policy has been developed and defence policy has been developed over decades.
We must close,
the threat
please.
is to the shipyards on the Clyde and on the Forth, and the SNP need to wake up to it.
Can I remind members that speeches of a tight 6 minutes. Michael McMahon to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. While it's undoubtedly welcome that BAE Systems has chosen the Clyde for the construction of the future Type 26 combat ships, we should be in no doubt that this work will only ever materialise in Governor Scotstoun if they, like the rest of Scotland, remain part of the UK, or the White Paper tells us next week that an independent Scotland is going to see massive investment on a similar scale to the UK's future naval procurement for the newly created Scottish Navy. Somehow I doubt that's what we can expect. So the reality we face is that Scottish independence will put at risk the Scottish defence industry and with it the wider Scottish manufacturing sector. Now, before the scaremongering klaxon sounds, let me explain why the defence sector is so important to the wider manufacturing sector. When I was a welder during the 80s and 90s, engineering in Scotland was going through a very difficult period. If we were not losing whole companies like Caterpillar, Cummins or Finley's, and so many others, we were seeing downsizing on a massive scale. Skilled tradesmen in Lanarkshire were having to travel further afield to the oil rig manufacturing yards or to the defence contractors on the Clyde or Rosyth in order not simply to find work, but to retain their skills. And recently, I was in discussion with union representatives at a major manufacturing company in my constituency, which has undergone a very difficult period of rationalisation, redundancy and short-time working. And the unions were expressing concern that many tradesmen had left that company rather than try to continue to eke out a living under the financial constraints inflicted on them by the firm's circumstances. Those welders, platers and electricians were looking for some stability and saw it in the shipyards where the defence work is being carried out at present and could be in the future. So why then, when up to 90% of the orders received by Scotland's shipbuilding industry are from the MOD, would the SNP want to introduce a barrier to this trade and put the job prospects of so many highly skilled workers at risk? In putting down amendments today which raise the issue of Trident, while making the members of the SNP backbenches happy, it does nothing to address the reality facing workers in the defence industry in Scotland today. Academics have clearly said that as many as 16,000 defence jobs would be affected by independence, including those on the Clyde and at Rosyth. And yet this government seeks to deflect attention away from that by throwing in an issue that even they can't agree on any longer, but which suits their purposes this afternoon. And also, the SNP blithely promote the idea that Scottish shipyards could be used to build submarines, but rather than provide a well-considered answer to diversification, this merely illustrates their lack of knowledge about the defence sector and shipbuilding. While it was the case that the Motherwell Bridgework Company benefited from large contracts in the 1980s to build submarine hulls, not only has that work gone, but the factory itself is now a housing estate. And that company had the highest level of coded welders in Scotland at that time, as skill levels required to build submarine hulls was so extensive. The shipbuilding workforce in Scotland does not currently have the specialist skills needed to build submarines. Now, that's a sad reflection and an indictment, but it is a fact. So while in the longer term such work could lead to the creation of good jobs, acquiring those skills would be a lengthy and costly process and would not be a short-term solution to the adverse impact of losing major defence contracts due to Scotland becoming independent. And that's why people who know a bit about these things, such as John Dolan, the GMB convener at Scotstoun, are not just sceptical about the SNP's defence contracting plans, but scathing about them. As John Dolan rightly points out, if Scotland votes yes, we will not be building ships for the UK government. And that is simply a fact. Yet, according to Nicola Sturgeon, we are the only shipbuilders capable of doing that work. Well, clearly she's never heard of an organisation called the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions, which brings together the workforces of all the shipbuilding sites across the UK. It has 1.2 million members. That hardly suggests that there is no other place in the United Kingdom that can build ships. So the very existence of those shipyards means that Nicola Sturgeon's claim that there is nowhere else for the work to go is either ill-informed or deliberately misleading. The SNP need to stop playing with people's livelihoods in this way. It is far too important. And the reality is that next week we expect the much-heralded white paper from the Scottish Government. Well, that's after the media get hold of it first, obviously, as it isn't really for the Parliament to have its place recognised.
Final minute.
But we will learn that supposedly what we can expect in an independent Scotland. We'll be expected to believe what it contains because the Government says so. It's their policies and it tells us how things will be. However, when the UK Government and UK-wide political parties state that their policies, these are simply dismissed and denied if they do not sit with the SNP's point of view of the world. So when Whitehall states that post-independence, the rest of the UK would not award certain defence contracts to Scotland, just as it will not presently give them to foreign countries, we are told not to believe that. So not only will the White Paper tell us what Scotland will do, it would seem it will also tell us what Scotland will tell other countries what they will do. That is not good enough for the workers on the Clyde. That is not good enough for the defence industry in Scotland, and that's why we should support the Labour motion today.
Thank you. Call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. You might be rather sceptical about the idea, but I think there's been actually some very substantial consensus on some important things in this debate. The Labour motion, when it talks about the skills of people in Scotland who are employed in the defence forces, is something which I think has attracted unanimity across the chamber. I think, too, when we've talked about the need to look at rationalisation, diversification, there has been a recognition shared in the contributions across the chamber that relying simply and forever alone on defence is unlikely to be good enough. It's worth making the point, of course, that many of the issues we're debating today are very far from new. I refer in particular to a decision the UK Cabinet made on the 19th of May 1920, which was in relation to diversification in the defence industry. And in particular, they gave permission for the government's own Woolwich arsenal to take on private work because the defence industry was no longer sufficient to keep that employment at the level it had previously been. They paid off 1,500 workers. Does that sound slightly familiar? And sought to diversify. We've heard references specifically by Willie Rennie to sovereign capability, indirectly without those words from Murdo Fraser and once again from Michael McMahon. Let's just examine the reality of the record. I'll start with a Ferry Rotodyne, which was a very innovative UK project to build new vertical takeoff bulk carrying transport. That was ultimately cancelled in 1962 by the UK government. And what did they buy instead? They bought Boeing Chinooks to be deployed in, I've lots more, I may come to you later, Boeing Chinooks to be deployed in the front line. Now, Willie Rennie did say fixed wing, and I will come to fixed wing as well, so he need not worry. We also saw the Blue Streak missile, which was to be the missile to carry the independent nuclear deterrent for the UK.
That proved to be unsupportable by the government of the day, and we now buy the missiles, or rather we lease them from the United States. We're not allowed to launch them against anyone without, on each specific occasion, getting the codes that enable us to do so. Sovereign integrity? I doubt it. And let me talk about the TSR-2, which was a fixed-wing aircraft that was leading the way in technology, in capability, cancelled once again in the 1960s by the UK government. And what did they seek to buy instead? American F-111s. Now, ultimately, that's not what they bought. The F-111s, incidentally, gained the unenviable nickname until they were used some 10 years ago by the Luftwaffe and by the German Air Force as the Widowmaker. There was such an aircraft that wished to operate. And, of course, finally, the Harrier jump jet. A gem, a leading-edge piece of technology, now no longer manufactured here, but to be bought by the UK government from elsewhere. Willie Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
It has given us an education in the various forms of equipment, but nobody has ever said that all equipment is bought in country. But the defence industrial strategy under the Labour government and the defence and security policy developed under this UK government has determined what the sovereign capability is. And it's those four areas that I identified. Does he not recognise that no British complex warships have been built outside the UK since the Second World War?
Stuart Stevenson.
I invite, Presiding Officer, the member to examine the official report afterwards. He very specifically linked sovereign capability to fixed-wing aircraft. TSR-2, the Harrier GR5A, and so on. It's absolutely clear that sovereign capability is not what determines the purchasing decisions of the MOD and the UK government. It is the best place to get the best equipment, and Scotland will remain the best place to get much of the equipment that they will require in future, and Scotland will require in future. The Scottish defence industry is a feisty industry full of feisty people. We've heard quotes from a wide range of them, from the Ministry of Defence itself, from the workers whose voice must be heard in this debate. They have skills. And it's interesting that Michael McMahon chose to talk about Motherwell Bridge and how in a short space of time, from closing it down, the skills dissipated and could not be reconstituted. My friends in Portsmouth know that all too well in advance of that fate being visited upon them. They certainly won't be in the same place as Scotland will be under independence or not to support the orders that they are. I will support everyone on the Clyde, whatever the result of the referendum. Everyone else must do likewise.
James Kelly, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate this afternoon, because this is a real debate dealing with matters that affect people on the ground in Scotland. It notes with regret the job losses on the Clyde. It talks about the importance of the sustainability of the shipbuilding industry and rightly points out to the dangers of independence. And that is a debate that this Parliament should be having. And the reality is that the SNP government aren't really been interested in bringing forward proper debates in recent times. We recently had a 2.5-hour debate, looking forward to a golf tournament at a time when £30 million had been exposed, has been lost on the abandoned Glasgow Airport Rail Link project. And then next week, Deputy Presiding Officer, more public money will be wasted as a white paper is published in Glasgow rather than being brought forward to its rightful place in this Parliament. So this is an important debate because it's dealing with the real issues. And I think it is important to look at the shipbuilding industry in Scotland and the benefits of operating within the UK market, because a third of the UK shipbuilding jobs are allocated in Scotland, including 3,000 on the Clyde and 2,000 at Rosyth. We benefit from 50,000 jobs in the defence industry in Scotland. And it really would be naive to think that if we did vote to go independent, that those jobs and those industries would not be undermined. The reality is we'd be moving from a market of 63 million customers to 5 million customers, and moving to that shrinking market not only would undermine the shipbuilding industry, but would undermine our ability as a country to trade. Just look at the figures. £45 billion is currently traded to England, Wales and Northern Ireland, compared with £22 billion to the rest of the world. The dangers to that trading of independence are absolutely clear. The Minister talks about talking up Scotland and promoting Scotland. Perhaps he should start with his own government and his own contracts that he's responsible for, because in the initial allocation of contracts on the Forth Crossing, the first allocation of £230 million of contracts, only £72 million of them were allocated. It's about Scottish industry. Were allocated to Scottish companies. Over 70% of them allocated to non-Scottish companies. I give way to Margaret MacDonald.
Margaret MacDonald.
Member for giving way. If we can get back to the Clyde and shipbuilding, can the member explain why the shipbuilding in the Clyde should be at such a perilous state just now, when 40 years ago, when I represented the constituency, it was in exactly the same perilous state, because it's been hanging on by its fingernails since 40 years. And I wonder if the member agrees with me that it would be a good idea to try something else.
James Kelly.
I think people from across the chamber have recognised and acknowledged the regret at the decline of shipbuilding. Indeed, Joanne Lamont, in her opening contribution, agreed that we should work at looking at a sustainable shipbuilding industry going forward. But I think we should not lose sight of the decision that we're going to be taking next year in relation to independence. Because Annabel Ewing spoke about the EU exemption on Article 346. That currently allowed £3 billion of business to be allocated to Scotland between 2007 and 2011. If Scotland were independent, that exemption wouldn't apply anymore. And that is the type of exposure. No, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. That is the type of exposure that we need to be alive to. And I also think looking at the wider issue of how we support workers across the United Kingdom, I think the words of Mick Magahey in his speech to the 1968 STUC are still very relevant today, when he argued against independence on the basis that he wasn't prepared to leave alone the mill workers of Manchester or the dockers of Liverpool.
Final minute, and I'd be grateful if you could be on the defence industry.
On the issue of looking after workers in the defence industry and all industries throughout the United Kingdom, I and my Labour colleagues will not support independence, unlike the SNP, who would be quite happy to abandon people in Sunderland and Ipswich and in Portsmouth to perpetual Tory government. We will not do that. And summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Order, please. The member's closing.
I support the Labour motion, which recognises the contribution of shipbuilding that the UK market makes in Scotland, recognises the benefit of the UK, and also the fact that independence would be a liability to the future of the shipbuilding industry in Scotland.
I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Jamie Hepburn, and I ask members to adhere to the terms of the motions and amendments.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is an important issue, not just for the future of the defence industry in Scotland, but also for all of Scotland. It's rather unfortunate, however, that it has been turned into a constitutional issue by members of the No campaign. And sometimes some issues actually can be above the constitutional debate that's taking place. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, some members from No campaign can't actually rise above that. Johann Lamont, in her comments earlier... Order in the front benches, please. Johann Lamont, in her comments earlier, spoke about... she listed a number of individuals certainly from the Yards who have indicated that if Scotland were to vote yes, then shipbuilding would be lost in the Clyde. But certainly in the men that I've been speaking to over the last 10 days or so, the men who actually work in the shipbuilding industry, men who actually work in Glasgow, they actually understand that what has actually been said up to now has been nothing short of scaremongering from the Labour Party. They also know that the reason that the work is actually going to Glasgow is because of the first-class workmanship, because of the excellent record, and also because of the better business case. And certainly, if Scotland were to vote yes next year, one moment, if Scotland were to vote yes next year, then the Type 26 orders could actually still come to Scotland. Mr Gray.
Ian Gray. Am I right in understanding the member is saying that the trade union conveners who Johann Lamont quoted are not representing the views of the workforce? Because I think if that's what he's saying, he should say it very explicitly. Stuart McMillan.
But what I'm saying, Mr Gray, is that I've been talking to people who actually work in the industry as well, and no doubt that yourself, you have, so no doubt Mr Gray has done as well. But certainly I can only inform the Chamber of the discussions that I've had with individuals who actually work in the industry, and I dare say that certainly, maybe the comments from Mr Gray and Ms Lamont certainly may well be the case as well, but I know that people I've been speaking to know that it's scaremongering that's actually coming from the Labour benches. Okay, Margot.
Margot MacDonald.
I hope the member thinks that it strengthens his argument to recall that Jimmy Reid decided that independence was the way forward.
Stuart McMillan.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more with Margot MacDonald. So I want to focus upon two issues. First is certainly the role of the defence industry in Scotland today, with the focus on shipbuilding, and secondly, to look at the potential that awaits that industry and the rest of the defence industries in an independent Scotland. I will also touch upon the issue of Faz Lane and its future. The motion before us raises some basic issues. That we all believe that the defence industry is an important element in Scotland's economy. But while we on these benches are prepared to stand by the workforce in Glasgow and the Glasgow Yards to protect jobs, other parties qualify their support for this workforce, dependent upon how they vote in the referendum. And we even have the position that the local Labour MP for the area, Ian Davidson, wanting to take the jobs away from his own constituents by calling for a break clause to remove the work if Scotland votes yes next year. The defence, I'm sorry, I've taken two already, Mr Rennie, I'm sorry. The defence industry is important to Scotland's economy. It provides many highly skilled jobs. Many of the companies involved are leaders in their field, relying on the well-qualified and well-trained workforce. And shipbuilding is a key aspect of this industry, and one which actually does have a long history in Scotland. At one time, the Clyde shipyards produced around 1/3 of the world's shipping tonnage. At its peak in the 1920s, and to as recent as the 1950s, there were around 100,000 shipbuilding jobs in Scotland. Now, after years of mismanagement of the economy and the industrial sector by successive UK governments of varying political colour, by 2011 there were only around 6,000 shipbuilding jobs in Scotland. And with the recent job losses announced by BEE, the numbers in the Clyde yards were reduced by a further 800 or so, leaving only around 2,300 jobs. Now, the Guardian leader comment on the Wednesday, the 6th of November, stated, "This is what happens when a whole political generation fails to develop an industrial strategy. It's another blow to the coalition promise to rebalance the economy." Famous shipyards have been consigned to the history books. All that potential and all those jobs are lost. The jobs went, all the shipyards are gone, all that industry is gone. The one yard that's left building ships on the lower Clyde, it's Ferguson's in Port Glasgow, and also with Garville Clyde Limited doing ship repair in Greenock. And certainly in terms of Ferguson's, with the award of the £20 million order from this Scottish Government, allowing Ferguson's to actually build ships again for the first time in 5 years, that was very much a welcome addition. I've taken two interventions already, Mr McNeill, sorry. Incompetent UK Government ministers who had no industrial policy and politicians with their focus on the service sector, all of them have left us where we are now.
Final minute.
Okay. The Clyde Yards are being retained by BEE for one reason. They are the best place to build warships in the current UK. The skills, abilities and experience of the workforce has ensured that BEE sees a future for those yards. But we do still have politicians trying to undermine the contracts for the Clyde Yards, despite the evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee, evidence which they refuse to publish in the reports, that there are no barriers to the MOD ordering ships from Scotland. Vice Admiral Andrew Matthews, the Chief of the Material Fleet, when asked if the Type 26 frigates could be built in the Clyde if Scotland was outside the UK, said that's absolutely the case. It depends on the outcome of the referendum and the timing of the 26th order. That is one of the options open to us. Another quick point, Presiding Officer. The GMB, in a letter of the 5th of March 2012, indicated regarding the Mars contracts that went to South Korea that they actually, that GMB described it as an exocet to UK shipbuilding. Now, I certainly wholeheartedly support the the amendment in the name of Keith Brown, and I certainly support shipbuilding in Scotland.
Thank you. I call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say I welcome this debate. I regret some of its terms, but I do recognise the importance of shipbuilding to our country. I think it would be an exaggeration to say I grew up in the shadow of the yards, Presiding Officer, but not a million miles away, within earshot of the horn, rather than, if not in the shadow of the yards themselves. So I know the importance of the industry to Glasgow, and Clydeside is an important part of our country's industrial heritage, and it has to be an important part of our country's industrial future. And I very much hope that this is a perspective shared across the chamber. I think that point was made very well by Stuart Stevenson. I do regret the conclusion of the motion that seeks to make this a constitutional bun fight. We hear consistently from the Labour benches that the SNP has a constitutional obsession, but this is just another example of the inconsistency of that argument, because it's most frequently I find that it's actually the Labour Party that bring the Constitution up in this chamber. And frankly, having a number of members stating directly that the yards will close and jobs will go in the context of independence, I think that can only be fairly described as naked scaremongering. I think Anna Sarwar, as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, no thank you Mr Gray, made the point that this didn't need to be a constitutional issue, it didn't need to be a constitutional ramie, it should have been heeded, but nonetheless we are, and I'm happy to debate the issue in that context. Joanne Lamont said she was keen to ensure trade union voices are heard in the debate. I am too, and I know that Jamie Webster's words have been quoted already, but I think they're worth hearing again what he said on Newsnight Scotland of the Type 26 contract. What I will say and declare publicly of the situation is that Scottish people, by democratic vote yes. I would expect, no, sorry, demand that every single politician of every section supports us to hell and back. He's absolutely right to make that demand. No thank you, Mr Smith. No thank you, Mr Rennie. It is then extraordinary to have the local member of the UK Parliament actually thereafter call for a break clause in those contracts so that the MOD could withdraw work from Scottish yards in the event of a yes vote. Joanne Lamont suggested that Mr Davison was second to none in his defence of shipbuilding. I think it's a peculiar form of defending that industry and his constituents. It's one of the most cynical calls I think I've ever seen actively working against the interests of his constituents. No thank you, Mr Rennie. Whilst mentioning Mr Davison, I think it's also interesting to see, I think he made a quite extraordinary statement on the day that the government made its statement, the UK government made its statement about shipyards in the House of Commons. He said that this has been an excellent day for shipbuilding and industry on the Clyde. That comment is still up on his website. Well, we of course all welcome the greater certainty for the future of the Clyde yards, but what he called an excellent day was a day in which over 800 people in those yards lost their jobs. How excellent a day would they have felt it to have been? And I think it's also a sad thing to reflect on as well. Joanne Lamont and Willie Rennie made this point that this is a day that was coming. They knew that this was a day that was coming. Well, what that speaks to me of, and I think Margaret MacDonald made this point, that this is a long-standing issue. What we see with UK control of shipbuilding in Scotland is managed decline of the industry. Joanne Lamont referred to 100,000 people working in shipbuilding jobs at its peak, but more recently, in 1998, we saw 10,100 people working in shipbuilding in Scotland. In 2011, that was down to 6,600. That's a one-third decline in 13 years, and we now see the number to fall by a further 15% with the recent announcement. The point has been made, and it's been made well, about the BAA recognising the expertise of the Clyde Yards. They are the place to build the Type 26 frigates. They can and will be built there when we are independent. I think we should reflect on the fact that BAA, Scottish shipyards, already build ships for countries outside the UK. Whatever the circumstances may be, they already do that. They were involved in £1.5 billion worth of export contracts with BAE Systems, including 8 ships for Malaysia, Brunei and Brazil, and the reactivation of 5 frigates for Romania and China. So the question, though, and I think this is the most important question, Presiding Officer, is what is the future for these yards once those Type 26 frigates are built? On the current trajectory, will we be looking at another day we all knew was coming? Independence can actually help secure the future, far from threatening these yards. If an officer, it can help secure the future of the yards. I want to compare our situation with that of Norway. It has been mentioned. In Norway, the building of ships, boats and oil platforms employed 22,210 people in 2011. In 2012, in Norway, 42 shipyards built over 100 ships. Murdo Fraser set out how we have a very competitive market and so on, and that's absolutely the case. I cannot disagree with that, but that's the reality of shipbuilding in Norway compared to the reality here in Scotland. When we are independent, we will need the expertise of Scotland's shipbuilding sector. And Murdo Fraser inadvertently made the point. He said he cannot conceive of the circumstances in which a Scottish government wouldn't award contracts to Scottish yards. What he is saying is that there will be work for the industry in an independent Scotland, Presiding Officer. He is absolutely right. And in the letter from the Scottish Global Forum to Mr Rennie that I have a copy of, they make the point, and I think he did misrepresent their report incidentally, and they certainly think that they talk about the number of vessels that could be procured from the Scottish yards in the context of independence. So let me conclude, Presiding Officer. I think we should all get behind Clydeside and Rosyth, no matter our constitutional future, but let's hear no more about independence threatening Scotland's industries.
Many thanks. Now call on Drew Smith to be followed by Chick Brodie. An exact 6 minutes, no more, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The announcement 2 weeks ago of very significant job losses was not unexpected, but it remains a major blow, and it is not possible to talk about the issues raised in this motion without thinking of those who are at risk of losing their jobs. Both the Clyde unions and the management are, in my view, to be commended for the constructive way in which they are negotiating at the moment with each other in the best interests, not just of the current workforce, but of those who we hope will work there in the future. There is no better advocate or no more forceful advocate for the Clyde than those who work in those yards, and they should be listened to. And I appreciate that government backbenchers have been handed their copy of Jamie Webster's quote and have stuck to and have dutifully read it out throughout this debate. I don't disagree with Jamie Webster at all on this. Of course, in the event of that outcome, we would have to get behind the Clyde yards. The problem is, I don't want to just get behind them arguing for something when they are put in a difficult position. I want us to have influence over those things. And that is the point, actually, which all of the other union conveners have been making. Others have said that the crucial issue for the success of the Clyde yards is a healthy order book, but in fact there are two issues: orders and skills. So I know that the unions will be making the case for apprentices who have been a major source of pride for everyone who knows the Clyde yards. It is absolutely vital that training continues to take place and that the yards continue to be seen as an attractive career choice for young people in Glasgow and from far beyond, because only with a maintenance of those skills and the training of new apprentices will the yards be able to take advantage of the UK's policy of procuring UK defence ships within our borders and to build the new orders which I would wish to see, most crucially amongst which is the Type 26 global combat ship. The extra work on the Queen Elizabeth class, which is to be transferred from Portsmouth, is, as Murdo Fraser said, very welcome, as is the order for offshore patrol vessels. And it is this work which can bridge the gap in the period up to the order of the Type 26. And the Type 26 itself is the next major order which could and should be placed with Clyde yards following the aircraft carriers and the Type 45 destroyers before them. Those ships, the daring class, are in British service now, and no one who has any interest in Clyde shipbuilding will fail to notice that it was HMS Daring which arrived in the Philippines this week, bringing with it much-needed UK aid for that country. And I want to see Daring, Dauntless, Diamond, Dragon, Defender and Duncan, who were all commissioned by the last Labour government, joined by a new class of Clyde-built frigates, which can play their role in the defence of the United Kingdom and indeed projecting British influence at sea, ships which Glasgow can be proud of. And BAE Systems have made clear that their preference is for building these UK defence ships in Glasgow. And therefore, the single biggest threat to that order coming to Scotland and Govan is now the loss of the yard status as domestic UK shipbuilders. UK yards are able to compete for this work under Article 346 rules, as others have said, which assist the UK to place orders for UK defence ships within the UK. And I listened with interest to Annabel Goldie, but to Annabel Ewing, I apologise, on this issue of Article 346, because the provisions exist in order for governments to make decisions in the interests of themselves as member states. You rightly said that. You have to be in the member state to benefit that. The articles, she's absolutely right. I can anticipate what she's saying, so I don't think I need to hear it, other than to say, well, certainly.
That was very kind of you to let me intervene. I mean, do you disagree that, does a member disagree then with the UK MOD Minister, who said on that very question, could a Clyde Yard, when Scotland has voted yes, still receive work from the rest of the UK? And he says, I think the answer is technically yes, if it was in our national interest to do so. I think that's very clear.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I did successfully anticipate what Annabel Ewing was going to say. Technically, it may be possible for something to happen. It doesn't make it likely, or the decision that any government is likely to take that decision against the interests of workers within, as she put it herself, the member state. So I think we do need a bit of realpolitik in this debate. The Nationalists have tried with little success to convince the workers at the yards that all this will somehow not matter. It's been suggested the Clyde Yards could simply and apparently immediately diversify into other kinds of shipbuilding. And like Joanne Lamont, I would certainly be supportive of any intelligent ideas for new work. But glib statements ignore the highly specialised nature of these yards as defence shipbuilders. And of course forgets that the Govan business was actually bought by British Aerospace following a Norwegian owner, Caverna, which tried to make exactly such a business work on the Clyde. So I'm not clear whether the Scottish Government have actually urged BAE Systems to build commercial ships, such as car ferries or tankers, on the Clyde, but I would be very interested to know their response, given that they are a defence contractor. And if it is not positive, can we then presume that the Scottish Government believes
Members in his last minute.
that BAE should sell the Clyde Yards to someone who might be prepared to make a business like that work? I think the workforce will be only too aware of the uncertainty that would bring. The second suggestion, and only other suggestion, apart from that the UK should simply buy Scottish, regardless of whether Scotland is in the UK or not, is that the yards will be kept busy building a Scottish Navy. And the SNP amendment before us today seeks rather shamelessly to divert the debate from jobs in the defence industries to the issue of Faslane. And this is probably the only ever case of a government trying to distract from significant job losses by promising even more for a different group of workers, because we're told that the £163 million annual saving from Trident can now be spent building boats, but we're not told on how many or how they will be procured, and we already know that that money has of course been spent on resurrecting the historical regiments, international development, renewable energy, higher welfare benefits, earlier pensions, tuition fees, skills and training. I could go on, Presiding Officer, but I will respect your impeachment not to.
Colin Chick-Brodie to be followed by Sandra White. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. May I first of all share Annabel Ewing's view on the situation at Portsmouth and the proposed loss of jobs in that fine city. Presiding Officer, let me start by drawing a couple of pictures. Picture one. Labour motion states it notes the benefit to the industry of UK defence contracts and considers the best way to safeguard the future of Scotland's defence manufacturing industry is to remain in the UK. Well, let me then help them with some numbers. In 1921, shipbuilding jobs in Scotland, 100,000. In 1955, almost 100,000. In 1998, no SNP government yet, 10,100. Pure decimation. 2011, 6,600, and now 2015. how can you possibly blame an SNP government for that kind of decimation and destruction of an industry? Picture 2. I spent the last 2.5 years researching and trying to find out why Westminster governments had denied oil and gas production, as we suspected there was in the Firth of Clyde in the early 1980s, of what the Secretary of State for Scotland, presiding officer at the time, a local Ayr MP, said was there in exploitable quantities. Why? Because, and I have the confidential ministerial papers here, because the Ministry of Defence refused to allow drilling in specific areas because of, quote, special circumstances. Well, that we know means nuclear submarines. So over 30 years, we've lost thousands of jobs, not just in shipbuilding, because of this cover-up. Can you imagine the oil rig production and maintenance of supply chain in Govan if we'd been allowed to go ahead with that plan? Thousands of long-term jobs lost, and for what? Our motion states the choices that could be made to support increased diversification, that's what it was, and take action to allow us to boost export is absolutely right. And because of Westminster obsequity to previous nuclear submarines and now Trident, £100 billion spent, we have lost that economic added value. Yet still, Labour continue to attach themselves to the seekers of the lost empire. And that's what it's about, not just about UK defence contracts. Years of missed opportunity, of a lack of vision, of a lack of planning and strategy. And as Charles Harity, a senior organiser of the GMB, and he's a real person, said just last week, quote, "I would say it's more a case of no planning, no strategy. This is really about whether a British government, and applies years past, has had any kind of industrial strategy at all. And the evidence of today shows that they haven't. They never have. And still the party, the Labour Party, wishes to hitch itself to a condemned boat that is steadily sinking. What is worse is the politicisation of what was clearly a commercial decision. The government contracts with British Aerospace Systems. It doesn't contract with another country. And surely the business heads and the financial heads of British Aerospace Systems are to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in upgrading a shipbuilding facility, not because of a constitutional situation, but because of the skills, the quality and the best rate of return that they will get for their shareholders on that investment. And that understandable commercial judgment now and in the future will cross country boundaries. Joint procurement and defence contracts will allow the Clyde not just to compete and work with the MOD and the rest of the UK, but across many marine products and with many other countries. And that should be our aspiration for the people on the Clyde. And in fact, as part of a diversified industry in Scotland, there is no reason on earth why, on a commercial basis, why the Clyde should not be competing for business and working with other countries to do just that. Collaboration and development, I'm almost finished. Collaboration and development of specialisms is a secret of, as the MOD itself said in January this year, in times of budget pressures for all nations, it makes sense to maximise economies of scale and work with our friends to get best value for money on all sides. And we certainly will retain, I can't remember my last paragraph. As an international production, procurement and distribution manager many years ago for NCR, it never crossed my mind that the best way to build and sell a complete computer system, and some of our security systems, was to collaborate, to work in partnership with our sister companies in France, Switzerland and the USA to harness the best skills, the best quality, the best performance to meet our customer needs. And the same will apply with the absolute protection for security modules on the Clyde. That's what, with product diversification, the Clyde can do, and with product diversification, that's what the Clyde will do.
Many thanks. Now call on Sandra White, to be followed by Duncan McNeill. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I too would like to express my solidarity with the workers affected by this announcement, not only those in Glasgow, but in Rosyth, Filton and Portsmouth also. Now, I know the importance of these jobs only too well, and I'm going to explain that. But I'd just like to point out, it's a very well-known fact, particularly in these benches anyway, I'm presuming that the Labour Party has a memory also, that every single time there's a general election, the Labour Party comes out with the scaremongering stories to say we will lose our shipyards. Every single time from the 30 years that I've been involved in politics. And do you know what? It didn't work in 2007, it didn't work in 2011, and it will not work in 2014. The people will have saw through the ploy. And I think I said in the debate last week that I was angry about it, sad about it. And, you know, I still am, and I think you should actually look at yourselves, because the mantra of constantly belittling the people of Scotland, the people of Glasgow, the people of Govan, people in my constituency is becoming very, very thin. Yes, I'll take that.
Joanne Lamont.
Is Sandra White saying that John Dolan from the shipyards is belittling Glasgow and belittling the people of Scotland when he expresses his concern? The convener at Talis, who told me they have moved from uncertainty to vulnerability, is he belittling the industry that he cares deeply about?
Sandra White.
Thank you, President Officer. I didn't mention any of the names that you've mentioned, but, you know, the Labour... Excuse me a minute, Mr Smith. A lot of my constituents are affected by that. A lot of my family also. So if you stop sniping from the sides, I would like to finish that. I don't speak for the trade unions, but I speak for the people in my constituency and out with. And, you know, they're not the only ones that talk to us, me and others. The Labour Party is not the only party that people go to and show their concerns. I was at a conference on Saturday at Glasgow Caledonian University where we had a debate on independence. And, you know, out of all of the people at that conference, 2 people, one in the panel, said they would not be voting yes. Do you know that every single one of them said they'd be voting yes? And afterwards, we spoke about the shipyards, individually to people, and people who work. In fact, a person who works there who I'm meeting next week, and I won't say who the name is, just in case you happen to speak to others, I'm meeting with him next week. And not every single person in that shipyard says that it will close. So please don't tell me that the Labour Party speaks for every worker in the Clyde shipyards, because they don't. They don't speak for every single worker in the shipyards. And I'm sure people here will agree with me also, and outside. Now, I was born in Govan. My family, my father, my brothers, they all worked in the shipyards, and it was very, very vital to their livelihood in that area. And it's not just our family, many, many more, my uncles and others as well, worked in the shipyards, from Caverna to Hallandon Wolf to basically Stevenson and to Fairfield as well. So I know only too well about the heritage of the Govan shipyards. And I know too well as well what people were saying, like Chick Brodie, how it's been run down for many, many years. And we should be diversifying. We should be looking to the future. And that's what the shipyard workers are telling us as well. We should be looking to the future. But I'm talking about we're here and now. And the one thing I think that gets to everybody is the fact that you're decrying the skills of the shipyards workers, decrying them. Instead of supporting them, as the opposition should be doing, you're using this red herring to basically say, if you don't stick by the union, if you don't stick by what we tell you, you'll lose your jobs. You're not saying to them, you've got great skills here, you are fantastic workers, and we will do all we possibly can. If these jobs don't come to you, the defence jobs, we will do everything we possibly can to ensure that your skills are used elsewhere. That's what we should be doing, and that's why last week and this week as well, I say to the opposition, it's a disgrace, and you should be ashamed of yourself, scaremongering constantly all the time. Now, I want to pick up on something. Chick Brodie mentioned it, and I want to continue on from that. And it's about the situation where the defence work will never come to Scotland if we vote for independence. Chick Brodie mentioned the MOD, mentioned the fact that working together, he admitted some little bit about it anyway, about working with Australia on the Type 26 frigates. Now, an MOD press release says, and Chick had already mentioned other parts of it, areas of potential cooperation include future frigates with the Royal Navy's Type 26 design, the first of many opportunities for future corroboration. And if I can just quote one of your own party, Jim Murphy. Jim Murphy said on the 7th of November this year, cooperation on defence procurement is critical, enabling us to maximise our ability to basically go forward. That's one of your own party, and yet you argue against that. Let's be grown up about this. Are you all saying, all of you here on the unionist side, are you all saying that Westminster or a future UK government would be so little and small-minded that if their nearest country and competitor was us in Scotland, an independent party, where we had the best workforce, they would snub it and go elsewhere and build something much more expensive? Are you really saying
Members
that?
in the last 15 seconds.
Thank you. For goodness sake, grow up. Stop scaremongering the people and tell them you've done it for long enough. And as I said before, didn't work in 2007, didn't work in 2011, and it won't work in 2014 either.
Now Colin Duncan McNeill to be followed by Mark MacDonald, and remind members to speak through the chair, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer Joanne Lamont said that she is a Govan shipyard in her constituency, and I'm proud to say I've got my constituents in Govan Shipyard and BA Systems in Rosyth. They've had a long road there, of course. It's not been an easy road, and there are many reasons why we're in this situation with so little shipbuilding in Scotland. There is no doubt that that has been a difficult journey, but some of the issues that we've had brought that about. They don't change. EU competition laws don't change. Not change where it's yes or no doesn't change. That means that it's difficult, and we haven't. It's a long time since we've built and won a merchant ship. We can't even win competition to build Calmac ferries. So that's the scale of the challenge, and we can't ignore it. And of course, all of these other countries have went on over those years. They came and we taught them, and they built up their own capacity. And they decided, as independent nations, that they would just rather build them ships themselves. We heard from the Deputy First Minister, which I found was most offensive, that I hope it wasn't deliberately misleading. I hope she was badly advised when she read out that statement, that this was an issue that we could overcome. In independence, we would build Australian ships. We haven't built an Australian ship for 35 years. The reality and the scale of the issue cannot be it can't be. We can't appreciate how that is. But we got to a stage about 15 years ago, which was welcomed by all the trade unions and indeed, I think, all of the political parties. Labour government was in power, and we got to a stage where it was not the shipbuilding that we knew. It didn't employ the tens of thousands of people that did in the past due to some of the things that I've referenced. We couldn't compete effectively. We never invested effectively. We used to build out in the rain where people built inside, all of these things. The shipbuilding that we see now across Europe and other countries import the steel hull. There isn't those steel workers working in Germany. They export them from Poland and exploit the cheap labour there, all sorts of different ways of building. We have missed those chances and challenges to keep up. So we've got this small amount of people who are working and building ships. You used to call it the rent book in the Clyde. The grey ships were the basic backbone. That's what you were guaranteed. And I concede to the Minister that has been seen as a rent book and a subsidy for shipbuilding ever since. And that's the only orders that we can win. That's why it's absolutely vital and important that we don't risk it. We cannot risk that situation where the UK government will not sign off those ships because we have not got, regrettably, a plan in place that's going to carry that workforce. We haven't looked, no thank you, we haven't looked at that diversification, but we have got a situation where the threat is imminent, only a year away where those ships will be signed off or not. And I suggest too, and somebody mentioned Ferguson shipbuilders here, who were promised a ship in 2007. And the Scottish Government here and the previous executive here have worked very hard, and I'm grateful for that. It's in my constituency now that we eventually got those ships into Ferguson shipbuilders. But we cancelled a ship in between. We promised them a ship and we cancelled it. You know why we cancelled it? I suspect clearly we know why we cancelled it, because we knew, or we came to a conclusion, that we were going to be expending precious Scottish Government budgets to build a shipyard not in Scotland. And we had to wait 2 or 3 years till we finally got those contracts in. And it's right, and every government will do it, and I would argue that this government, whatever its shape, would do it in the future, that if we've got government budgets and we've got smaller ships to build, we should take every advantage and pull every stroke to ensure that they begin to Scottish shipyards. And that's what the UK government will do. But the real depressing factor that hits me today as we discuss these things is that we knew this was coming. We were talking about the gap in the orders. What have we done about diversification since then? What has Scottish Enterprise done to ensure that we build on the skills of the 800 ship designers that have designed a worldwide product that people want to build right across the Yes, Minister.
Minister. I'm happy to lay it when I conclude the various work that we have done to help apprenticeships and training on the Clyde through Scottish Enterprise grants. But can he say, does he not think that the UK government, which is in charge of defence, should have taken a lead on diversification? When has he criticised them for not doing so?
I think we really need to. I think we need to get together to discuss about diversification and shipbuilding, using the defence contract as a core and a backbone. We need to keep Mr Salmond, the First Minister, to his promise about reindustrialisation of the Clyde. We need to deliver on the renewable jobs. We need to re-equip the North Sea. We need to do all of these things. So it's no point of pointing to history and saying it was their fault when it's our time and we're not doing any better. Where is our manufacturing strategy? Where is our manufacturing strategy? That's the challenge to us today and in the future. Let us develop our manufacturing strategy, irrespective of independence or within the union. That's our responsibility, and let's face up to it.
Many thanks. I call on Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Margaret MacDonald briefly.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Next week, as members have alluded to, we'll be seeing the White Paper from the Scottish Government. Unfortunately, this afternoon, we appear to have seen the white flag from the Scottish Labour Party, because today they have made it clear in the comments that they have made that their support for the Clyde shipyards is conditional on the constitutional arrangements. And I wonder what those Clyde workers watching the debate at home would think today as Labour politicians queue up to write out the post-independence redundancy notices for those workers on the Clyde. Here today, they have declared that, unless Scotland votes no, the Labour Party sees no future for the Clyde shipyards. What an utterly depressing way for the Labour Party to conduct itself in Scotland. And the argument was made by some during the debate, notably Willie Rennie, who majored on this, about no warship having been built elsewhere. Stuart Stevenson, I thought, in an excellent contribution, took him to task on the issue around sovereign capability, particularly when he had mentioned it around fixed-wing aircraft. But I want to look at a quote from Hansard from January of 2011, looking at the issue of the Type 26 contract, where the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Defence, Mr Gerald Howarth, said, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has just returned from an extremely profitable visit to Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand and Turkey. All those countries have expressed interest in joining the United Kingdom in a collaborative programme to develop the Type 26. So it is entirely conceivable for warships to be constructed outside of the United Kingdom. The fact that it has not happened yet does not preclude the opportunity for it to be done so in future, as outlined by the Under-Secretary of State during his contribution. I've got a lot to get through. I'll maybe come back to Mr Rennie in due course. And Margaret MacDonald made the very important point that no less a man than Jimmy Reid, a man who was certainly second to none in his commitment to Scottish shipbuilding, certainly not second to Ian Davidson MP, supported Scottish independence. And the very notion that a man with such a strong commitment to the Scottish shipbuilding industry would support independence without thinking that the Scottish shipbuilding industry could see a prosperous and better future as part of an independent country, I think demeans the work that Jimmy Reid did throughout his life and the conclusion he came to that independence was the best way for Scotland to go. And we know this. We know that Ian Davidson MP is one to put out leaflets saying separation shuts shipyards. We know that the Better Together campaign have put out leaflets claiming shipyard jobs are more secure as part of the UK. But as my colleague Jamie Hepburn pointed out, the decline in jobs over time, while Scotland has been part of the Union, would suggest that it is the United Kingdom that shuts shipyards, and it is the United Kingdom which presents insecurity to the future of the shipbuilding industry in Scotland. And we can add that, I think, to the AAA credit rating stories from the Better Together campaign as yet another example of the reality belying the rhetoric. Now, I will back, Presiding Officer, the Clyde workers, whatever the vote in September. But I think what has been very disappointing to date is that we have seen too many opposition MSPs in this chamber writing off the future of the Clyde yards if there is a yes vote. Have they no ambition, no vision, no willingness to consider a better future? And it was interesting to listen to the contribution just there from Duncan McNeill, who spoke about those other nations, those small independent nations out there who have developed and allowed their shipbuilding industries to thrive. Can he not make the causal link between what has been happening to Scottish shipbuilding as part of the Union as compared to the abilities of those countries who have control over their own futures, over their own industries, and say there maybe is a better future out there? And Michael McMahon, who spoke of industrial decline in central Scotland, and I understand entirely the pain that is felt in those communities from the industrial decline, yet still the Labour Party wants to cling to the very political system that delivered that decline, because that political system, currently, as it stands at Westminster, condemns Scotland to occasional rule by the Conservative Party when the Conservative Party is not voted for by the people of Scotland. And I would point to James Kelly and say that he made the remark that we would be condemning England to perpetual Tory rule. The Labour Party would still have won the 1997, 2001 and 2005 general elections with all Scottish MPs removed from the equation. So the idea that England never votes Labour is a myth being perpetuated by Scottish Labour MSPs as some sort of faux solidarity argument. And the argument was made around Trident, and the idea that by removing Trident we would create economic insecurity. And yet a 2007 report, Presiding Officer, commissioned by SCND and the STUC, and who included among the members who compiled it one Claudia Beamish MSP, who at the time was the chair of Scottish Labour, concluded Scotland would economically be a net loser from any decision to replace Trident. There would be serious consequences for its public services and for employment over a prolonged period of time. Better Together, you couldn't make it up.
Thanks. Now call on Margaret MacDonald. Up to 2 minutes, please, no more.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can't make too many points, but I will say that I'm absolutely in solidarity with Duncan McNeill, because his ambitions are the same as my ambitions were and still are. And Chick Brodie made the same sort of points, and that was that at the end of the day, it's the bottom line that counts. There's not a government in Europe just now can afford to pay over the odds, and the United Kingdom government is particularly strapped for cash. So therefore, can I suggest that timing is all? In a fortnight after the Scots vote for independence, it's possible, it's just possible, that in England there'll be folk would maybe object if some warship orders for England were placed with a Scottish yard. That's a fortnight afterwards. A couple of years afterwards, who cares? How much is it going to cost in Scotland compared to elsewhere? That's the rule of thumb. But I talk about diversification with some bitterness, because when I was elected to govern, it was the same situation as it is just now. And I suggested that they could make liquid gas carriers. It was a market that was only just opening up. And the unions, I have to be honest about it, led by Jim Airlie, laughed at me and told everybody that I was a silly lassie. I wasn't a silly lassie then, and I'm no one now. There's still things could be built in the Clyde, but Duncan McNeill knows better than anybody else. The Upper Clyde is limited in the types of ships that can be built there. And as for diversification, it's been tried. Governor's did it. They built the upper structures for oil rigs. So lots has happened on the Clyde that we're talking about just now.
Down to a close, please.
It's a case of putting our mind to making sure that it happens in a logical, planned fashion.
Many thanks. We now move to closing speeches. Call on Alec Johnstone. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This has been a bad-tempered little debate. And in fact, it's not been one debate, it's been two debates, because there are those of us who wish to see the Union continue, who have been talking about one set of issues, and there seems to be a completely different set of issues that are being discussed by the party of government, and it seems never the twain should meet. First of all, can I take the opportunity, on behalf of those of us here on the Conservative side, to offer our solidarity with the workers in the shipyard, both those who are losing their jobs and those who will continue to have their jobs. And if that requires us to make the commitment out loud so everybody can hear it, that we will do everything necessary to ensure that the Type 26 frigates are built on the Clyde, whether before or after September next year, then we will make that commitment, just as I'm sure our friends opposite will make that commitment. The problem we have is that there is a lack of understanding as to who is responsible for what in this debate. If this debate is in any way a constitutional one, then who made it a constitutional debate? Whose motion, whose bill is it that made us go towards a referendum in September next year? It is this government who decided to make the Constitution the #1 issue. Keith Brown, in his defence against this motion, chose to make a desperate and futile defence of his party's position, which he only gave up to replace it with a vicious attack on the UK government. He went through all the things that have been done and all the things that he portrayed as failures, the cost of the aircraft carriers, the abandonment of the Nimrod programme, and, to tell you the truth, if that's the way he seeks to make friends, then I wouldn't like to be one of his enemies. However, he then went on to talk about other things. His amendment talks about Trident. The truth is that he tells us that these contracts could be won after Scotland became independent, and yet any such negotiation would take place at exactly the same time as his government was trying to close down the Faslane naval base. And if that's how you make friends, then I don't know what he intends to achieve through his negotiations. Give and take is how we negotiate traditionally. I suspect that he would not be willing to negotiate on that or many other points. The reality is that many times during this debate, red herrings have been raised. The concept of us working jointly with countries like Australia to develop the Type 26 has been raised as an example of how we can, of course, work across international boundaries. But we had speeches in the debate too that showed a bit more understanding about how joint defence procurement works. First of all, I don't believe for a minute that Australia intend building any of these ships themselves. But secondly, where joint defence procurement happens, it tends to be on the basis that contractor work is shared out among the customers. And the idea that Scotland will indulge itself in joint procurement work with another country when it is not, in fact, a customer for these ships is a bit naive. No, I will not. Because I want to go on to talk about the decision that was made by BAE to commit the work or to commit to the Govan and Scotstoun shipyards. I believe that they made that decision because the Govan and Scotstoun shipyards are the best place to build modern warships. I believe they made that commitment because they believe that the staff at these shipyards are the best people to build modern warships. But I also believe they made that decision based on the key assumption that Scottish independence will be decisively rejected. And that is the reason why they made that decision. I hear the constant whining from the SNP backbenches, but they've had, during the course of this debate, the opportunity to express themselves, the opportunity to make their case, the opportunity to set out why the rest of the United Kingdom might choose to build its ships here in Scotland. They've had the opportunity to make the commitment that has been asked for us from the trade unions and their leadership. We know the Clyde is the best place for the UK to build its warships, but they have chosen to put it at risk. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, our duty to support the shipyards and their workers. I will give the commitment that I will work to ensure that that work goes to the Clyde, but I will not delay the start of that commitment until the day after the referendum. It starts now, and my commitment is that I will fight Scottish independence to protect that jobs.
Many thanks. I now call on Keith Brown, Minister. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think, as Alec Johnson said, this has been a fairly ill-tempered debate and dominated, perhaps not unexpectedly, by the Constitution. But I think it's important to remember at this point that we are, in Scotland at least, talking about 800 people that will lose their jobs, and of course we've heard around 1,200 people elsewhere in the UK facing that prospect as well. And I think at the root of this, we have to remember that the support which the Scottish Government provides through PACE and through other means is vitally important to ensure those individuals can have the prospect of further employment if that's what they so wish. And that's the very important point, which I do take from the motion which has been submitted by Joanne Lamont. I think it is nevertheless regrettable that the Constitution has intruded in the way it has, and despite what Alec Johnson says, you have to look at the motion. But referring to this debate, the motion submitted by the Labour Party makes this a constitutional issue, and that's, of course, in stark contrast to the request of Joanne Lamont's Deputy Leader, who asked that we did not make this a constitutional debate, in stark contrast to the position of Jamie Webster, who said this should not become a political football. Instead, what we have is the motion which is quite clearly trying to identify the decision that was taken as being a constitutional consequence. And it's also said, incredibly, Joanne Lamont has said, and shall get the chance to clarify these remarks if I'm wrong, that the decision when it was taken was an example of the union dividend. That decision to cut 800+ jobs in Scotland and many more in the rest of the UK was an example of the union dividend. Yes, I will give way to Chief Coney.
Isn't it the case that, thank you for taking the intervention. Isn't it the case that as soon as the announcement was made about Portsmouth, that those people who are very skilled, engineers and what have you in Portsmouth, would almost automatically and immediately start to seek other jobs, so that by the time this decision theoretically would be changed for constitutional arrangements, there would be fewer people in the Portsmouth? Minister.
I think that's a natural consequence that people, especially at that skill level, if you know that there's not the future that you'd want to have at that yard, will start to look for other opportunities. That's natural enough, and of course it would have been useful had Willie Rennie acknowledged his own political ally in Portsmouth, who'd mentioned the fact that these jobs would be long gone by the time this contract has been awarded. But Joanne Lamont made the point when she was speaking that the SNP should look at their arguments and consider those because of the consequences. And I think that's not a bad discipline to do. We perhaps wouldn't do it in the course of this debate, but we should all, from time to time, check the arguments that we're deploying and the effects it will have. But I would say to Joanne Lamont, perhaps it's time for her to undergo a little bit of self-examination as well, because she's now got herself into the position, first of all, of ignoring the calls of her Deputy Leader not to make this a political issue. She's now got herself into the position of supporting her Conservative friends, I think was the phrase that Alec Johnson used. And bear in mind, of course, many Labour Party people out with this chamber say they don't have the stomach to work for the Tories, but obviously all these people here do like working with the Tories. And not a word of criticism has come from the Labour Party today about the various failures of the Tory government in terms of defence. It's all been directed, of course, at the SNP. And worst of all is the previously implicit, now explicit threats to the workforce on the Clyde. If you do the democratic thing and you don't vote the way we want, your jobs are gone. That's what the Labour Party is telling the people on the Clyde. And it's an absolute disgrace. That's what they should do. And of course, it's possible to say, as I think Alec Johnson tried to say, and we will say, whatever the outcome of the referendum, this government will help people try and retain those jobs. And just to go back to the previous point I made, and Joanne Lamont can respond to this, hopefully, in her summing up. I wrote to her on the 25th of June saying, I wonder if you could clarify whether Scottish Labour will commit to work with the Scottish Government to give our shipyards the best possible chance of winning this contract as soon as possible, thus safeguarding hundreds of jobs and the local communities that depend on them. I wrote on the 25th of June. I've still not had a response from Joanne Lamont. So perhaps that colours my view of her call for cross-party working. I do welcome the commitment from Alec Johnson to cross-party working. And the point, of course, is to provide the reassurances, should they be required from the UK Government, that the Type 26 contracts can, of course, be delivered in an independent Scotland. There's no question of that. Should also say, in terms of diversification, the point I was making to Duncan McLean was the simple fact that Duncan McNeill, if he is looking back, as he was, to what has not happened up to now in terms of diversification as he saw it, and I've pointed out to him the number of times, for example, 6 times this year, that Scottish Government ministers have been working just with BAE alone in terms of improving productivity and modernisation and job opportunities and apprenticeships. He's never said one word. And I pointed out to him about the UK Government is responsible for defence. Just let me finish this now, if you can. They're responsible for diversification because they're responsible for defence. They've got some responsibility as well. And as soon as I raised that, your response was to say, oh, don't look back. But your first point was to say, what have we done up to now? So all I'm saying is be even-handed. The lion's share of the responsibility has to be with the UK Government. And the Labour Party in the 1990s said at the end of the Cold War, we've got the Cold War now, let's make sure we make the premium from this, the fact that we can diversify arms jobs. And that's not happened. I don't know if you still want to come in.
Duncan McNeill.
I appreciate that, Minister. Maybe I concede that I didn't intend to take you back to that in that point. The point I was trying to focus on is surely it's not beyond the Scottish Government 6 years in power to connect up the skills shortage in the North Sea with an overabundance of skills in the west coast of Scotland, that we could have delivered renewable jobs and manufacturing jobs, and we could be renewing the vessels in the North Sea. Why is that beyond us after 6 years of government?
Minister? Can I say that's exactly the kind of work which has been going on? And just to point to a couple of examples, you'll know, of course, that Babcock have diversified in terms of the North Sea and renewables. At Rosyth, they've taken that position already. They're starting to do that. BAE, I think, as we all know, are a much more explicitly defence supply industry contractor. That's what they do. But where the diversification can take place, we've tried to support that. And just to come back to Willie Rennie's point, he was the person that opposed the extension to the Rosyth base that was applied for by Babcock. He opposed the future opportunities in terms of ferry terminals. So I take with a pinch of salt his support for diversification. Could I say as well that there was not enough mention, I think, of the fact the impact of the extended overruns on UK defence procurement. It's been wished away, not mentioned by either side. To go from £3.6 billion for aircraft carriers to £6.2 billion, or to spend £3.6 billion on aircraft which never flew a mile, you would think you would make a connection between that and the jobs which are lost in Scotland. We only get 5% of the UK defence procurement jobs in the UK. But I'm sure we could get an awful lot more if it wasn't for the case. The huge overruns and wastage that we see within UK defence procurement. And yes, of course, I'm more than happy to discuss these things with the UK, but you can't hide those facts, and we shouldn't hide those facts. We should point out, can you imagine what would happen here? I mean, James Kelly has had regularly debates with me about Garland, what he feels is expensive money spent, which was not then recouped, £30 million. We are talking about £2.6 billion. £2,600 million on the aircraft carriers, £3.6 billion spent on aircraft which never flew, were scrapped at a cost of £500,000 and got scrap value of £1 million. And not a word of criticism. You'd think you would make the connection in relation to that. Now, much has been said about the people that actually work on the Clyde, and everyone's got the person that they can refer to. I think, and I'll not repeat it, that Jamie Webster's comments are absolutely key. We seem to be getting something of a consensus around the fact that we should all commit to help out the workforce, whether the Scottish people vote yes or no. We should all do that. But I think there's somebody else as well that we should mention who said that the industry, this is somebody who's a former shipyard worker and a TGW official, the industry has for years been far too reliant on Admiralty contracts for warships. What we need to do is to diversify, build a range of craft like cruise liners, ferries and offshore patrol boats. What we mustn't do is allow all that skill, I don't know why Duncan McNeill finds this objectionable. What we mustn't do is allow all that skill, expertise and technology to disappear. And I feel that's what's happening under Westminster. We need to be in control so that we can make decisions here in Scotland that suit Scotland. Those were the words of former Lord Provost, Labour Lord Provost of Glasgow, Alec Mawson, and I support those.
Many thanks. Now calling Ian Gray to wind up the debate. Up to 10 minutes, please, Mr Gray.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And in closing this debate, I want to start by putting on record again the concerns expressed on every side of the chamber for those workers who face redundancy in BAE shipyards and their families, for whom this will be a difficult time. And I welcome the measures the Scottish Government have taken in Glasgow and Rosyth to help with that. But for those workers in Portsmouth, a particular mention, since for them this is more than the ebb and flow of contracts, but rather the end of a shipbuilding era. We all, I think, regret that. Yeah, this debate is about opportunity and the potential of a bright future for our defence industries, and rightly so, because this is an industry which demonstrates what is possible if we seize the opportunities the United Kingdom gives us. Contrary to the hand-wringing we've heard on the SNP benches, the UK defence sector is the second largest in Europe, and Scotland's skills, ingenuity and reliability have always ensured that we punch above our weight in claiming a share of that. 10% of defence jobs in Scotland, almost 12,600 people, way above our population share. 1/3 of the UK's shipbuilding, several times our population share, and not just shipbuilding, and not just the Clyde, Rosyth 2 and the largest defence electronics site in the UK, just down the road at Celex Galileo. Indeed, 1/3 of all MOD sites are right here in Scotland, and an estimated 50,000 jobs depend on the sector. So just as our electricity industry benefits from the single British energy market, and just as our universities benefit from access to UK-scale research funds, so our defence industry can make the most of a UK defence budget of £34 billion. And by the way, the cost of Trident, centrepiece of the government amendment, is of course included in that defence budget. So an independent Scotland's share of that would already be in the £3 billion Scottish defence budget. It's not some extra lottery win to get us out of any fiscal hole the government finds itself in on any given day. And as for using it, as the amendment suggests, for diversification, well, many speakers have talked about the difficulty over decades of finding ways of diversifying in the defence industry. It's not enough just to say the word. We have to hear the actual plans and suggestions. The one plan we do know about the SNP's defence ideas into the future is that they plan to diversify £500 million out of that defence budget and straight into the coffers of the banks and the energy companies as a cut in their corporation tax. That's what the SNP will replace 11,000 Faslian jobs with. They'll replace it with bigger bonuses for bankers and bigger profits for the energy companies. But, Presiding Officer, wide though our defence sector is, much of today's debate is focused on shipbuilding, where the issues are starkest. And no wonder, because the heritage of that industry looms large in our collective story, and not just for Clydesiders. I'm certainly not from Glasgow, as anybody who hears me can tell. But my granny's street in Leith had a shipyard at the bottom of the road. And I remember being shepherded into the hall at primary school to watch the launch of the QE2 on the Clyde on television. And 4 years ago, I was privileged to attend the launch of HMS Defender at Scotstoun, one of these Type 45 frigates. And the truth is that when those chains slip away and 8,500 tonnes of steel slips away with them, I defy anyone with a soul not to shed a tear. These ships are a living testament to and a symbol of our capacity to shape not just steel, but our world and our own destiny. And it is for that reason that this industry echoes down through our story in prose, in poetry, in song, in politics, and in this Parliament, as Joanne Lamont illustrated when she quoted Donald Dewar's great speech on our opening day. These are more than simply artefacts of steel, though. These ships are packed with the most sophisticated technology we have ever devised. They are the pinnacle of human ingenuity. And that industry deserves rigorous and honest arguments then, and it has not heard them today from the SNP benches. We've had tankers misrepresented as warships built elsewhere. We've had an argument, an absurd argument in the 21st century, that a global corporation like BAE could not recruit or transfer the skills to somewhere else in the United Kingdom to build these ships. Of course they could. We've had design partnerships misrepresented as agreements to build abroad. And we've even had the argument that because there have not been enough defence contracts in the past, as many as we would like to have seen, therefore we should turn our back on the ones that are available today. What kind of an argument is that? Now, every single SNP speaker has quoted Jamie Webster. If the situation is that Scottish people by democratic vote, yes, I would expect, demand that every single politician of every section supports us to hell and back. So let's be clear about this. And Mr Brown, this is your answer on Joanne Lamont's behalf. I have fought for shipbuilding jobs before. I did it in Whitehall when I worked for the Secretary of State for Scotland. And when I was Labour leader here in Holyrood and the carrier contracts were under threat, I suggested to Alex Salmond that we go together and fight for shipbuilding jobs. And we did that all the way, not quite to hell, but to Liam Fox's office, where we sat and made the case and we won. And if by some chance there is a yes vote next year, then I promise this. I will stand shoulder to shoulder with Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon or whoever, Alec Johnson even, and I will argue that those T26 contracts should stay on the Clyde. So will Joanne Lamont and so will Mr Drew Smith. No, Minister, you wouldn't give way to me. But understand this, that at that moment we will be arguing against a whole peacetime history of naval construction in this country, which has never built a warship abroad. At that moment, we'll be arguing against a government with a multi-billion-pound contract to award and the choice of spending it on jobs for their own citizens or jobs for ours. At that moment, we'll be arguing against EU law, which says a defence contract awarded externally must be awarded in open competition. And at that moment, we will be arguing with a Westminster Parliament whose Scottish representatives have lost all their authority. We will make those arguments. We will make those arguments to hell and back. But those arguments will by then have all the staying power of the proverbial snowball in that place. So we accept Jamie Webster's comments. We accept his comments. Why is it then that when his fellow conveners' comments are quoted in this chamber, if Scotland was independent, no one could build Type 26. There's no way on God's earth we can survive in an independent Scotland. No UK Ministry of Defence means no more shipbuilding jobs in Scotland. Why are these views then dismissed by the likes of Stuart McMillan and Sandra White? Why are these TU conveners told to grow up and stop scaremongering? No, Ms White. No. So yes.
The member is not taking an intervention. Sit down, Ms White.
We will make the case for the Clyde in any constitutional circumstance. But the tragedy is that this case is already won. The fight is over. The T26 contracts are heading for Scotland. The workforce in the Clyde have earned the right to those jobs. And the only thing which can threaten that, the only reason that we will have to go to hell and back and win the argument again is because of the SNP's independence project. The problem is not our motion, the problem is their referendum. And I don't suggest that colleagues on these SNP benches don't care about these jobs. I'm sure that I'm sure that those nationalist MSPs are sincere in their wish to keep those contracts on the Clyde. I'm sure those slipway chains tug at their heartstrings just as they did at mine. But the trouble is that whatever their heart says, their soul belongs to separatism. And this is the reality they cannot acknowledge. This is the credo that dare not speak its name. This is the inconvenient truth that they have tried to shout down all afternoon because they cannot face up to it. To the SNP, no matter how important shipbuilding might be, no matter how much those jobs matter, independence matters more to them. I think
you need to bring your remarks to a close, Mr Gray.
I think it's damaging, but I would respect it more if just one of them had the guts to stand up and say that they believe placing Scotland's shipbuilding industry at risk is a price worth paying for independence. That's the logic of their position, and if they really wish to transcend it, they should vote for the motion tonight and back those shipbuilding workers.